All righty, guys and ladies, I should say, because I see Miss Mary Jo is already with us this morning. Good morning, Mary Jo and Jason, and all of our viewers coming in. I'm very excited today because we are having this is although y'all recognize and new viewers, if you haven't, I've got his previous visit in the show notes for today, but we are branching off into Rhodesia today. You guys have been seeing me sharing some social media pictures, some stuff on Rhodesia, and I've been trying to learn as much as I can. And Mr. John Cronin, or I should say Dr. John Cronin, his book is just a masterpiece. And also, it is linked in the show notes. Please go over and buy it. But his book is his service with battalion recon with the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and then force recon in Vietnam. But he decided he wanted to get into some more combat and realized America was pretty much calling it quits with Vietnam, and he had just missed one more tour to get in on. So he went to Rhodesia, and I'm very glad we're getting into Rhodesia, and we've got him to help us out, branch into it. So without further ado, we've got RLI and a Selous Scout vet, Mr. John Cronin, returning for his part 2. And without further ado, Mr. John, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, bud. When we left off last week, I had just finished my second tour in Vietnam. I returned in August of 1969, I guess it was. And I went to school down in Charleston, South Carolina. I went to the Citadel as a veteran student. So I wasn't in the Corps Cadets, but I finished in 3 years because I was a little bit behind in my college education. So I compressed those 4 years into 3, going year round. And then I took a commission back into the Marines as an infantry officer. Went through Quantico for basic school, and then went down to Fleet Marine Force, mostly in North Carolina, although I was down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for a while. I went on another couple of floats. I spent some time in Panama in jungle warfare training, and then returned to Camp Lejeune. And I was with Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines as a first lieutenant. And then I got transferred up to division headquarters, where I became the division statistics officer. And that took care of my 3.5 years that I owed the Marines. They financed a lot of my education, so I owed them 3.5 instead of 3. And I had a very strange incident. I worked in an office with 2 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors, and a colonel. I was a first lieutenant, and there was another guy next to me, same rank. As I was leaving that day to check out of the Marines, I'm on my way to dispersing to get paid out. I come across a man coming up the steps of division headquarters, lieutenant colonel, and I salute him as I go down, and he returns salute, and we both turn around at the same time and look at one another. It turned out this was my company commander in Vietnam 7 years ago, a guy named O.O. Karchner. And he said, we chatted for a couple of minutes, and he said, well, what are you doing now? Listen, I'm taking a battalion out on a float right now. We're going to the Med on a 6-month cruise. I need a company commander. Now, I know you're on like first lieutenant, but I can get you, the rank to captain in the next 3 months if you want to take this job, because I'd love to have you. I said, sir, I'm going out of the Marines. I'm on my way to check out today. And he went, oh, it's too bad. Well, I get back from dispersing, get paid out, and I'm sort of packing up my stuff. And there's this lieutenant colonel in my office said, hey, John, look, I just caught a battalion. It's with 6 Marines, and we're going down to Guantanamo Bay for a couple of months, and I need a company commander. Would you be interested? And I said, sir, you won't believe this, but I just spoke with a fellow who offered me the same job. I'd love to go with you, but I have other plans. I want to go over there and be a Rhodesian, be a badass. So he sort of laughed about that. Anyway, I leave the Marines, and this is now in August of 1976, and I rock up into Rhodesia about 2 weeks later. And I stepped into a real beehive over there. That country was in just a fierce, bloody, awful war that had begun in the late 60s when uh, black nationalists, who were moderate black nationalists, were trying to convince the government to extend a one man, one vote to everyone, sort of a fair appraisal of what the social and political situation looked like. And there was a party, a political party that ran Rhodesia in those days called the Rhodesia Front, the RF. And that party was filled with a bunch of neo-Nazis because they didn't want to make compromise at all, in any direction at all. And there you see Rhodesia right there. And so what that did was it alienated the very black African moderates whom the government would later need in order to reach a political compromise so that they could share power with whites, with they were called whites were called Europeans over there. And it was an opportunity that was really missed because Ian Smith, who was the prime minister at the time, was sort of inundated with this objectionary sort of nonsense on the part of this extreme right-wing group that said, you can't compromise at all or we'll vote you out of office. And so he had no choice. And he had to play the hard game and play the long game instead of doing the short game, which was to bring these moderate black nationalists into the government, share power with the Europeans maintaining the dominant political sphere. And that war could have been averted. That was in 1968. But they didn't look at this long game. And at the short game they played, they said, no, we'll take our toys and go home. And we're not going to accommodate any sort of black nationalist aspirations. And if you guys want to fight, you can fight. Well, they had no choice. They were backed up into a wall. And there's Ian Smith right there. And so that is what sort of prompted that war. And as it developed more and more and more, I get over there about 6 years or 7 years after the war began, and it's in full swing by that time. And there are no compromises. There aren't any black nationalists left. When they lost their bid for sharing power, they were pushed aside by African radicals, people like Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe and Joshua Tonga Guerrilla and all kinds of individuals who felt that, well, we gave you a chance, you blew it, and now we're going to fight and we're going to win this war. No matter how many lives it's going to cost our side, you people can't afford the casualties. It's kind of like Ukraine today. They're outnumbered about 6-1 on the ground, and they're losing men at an unbelievable rate. And the Russians are simply going to wear them down. Russians don't care about losing manpower. They have absolutely no concern about feeding these guys into this meat grinder. But the Ukrainians can't absorb those kinds of losses. Well, this is exactly what Rhodesia was like. The population of that country was only 240,000 whites. Now, Rhodesia is about the size of Montana, if you can imagine. And they had an army of about 50,000 men who were supposed to guard about 1,500 miles of border, if you can imagine anything more frustrating than trying to do that. So they're drawing this army, this 50,000 man army, from this population, European population of 250,000. Well, at the time, there were 6 million African nationalists, 6 million Africans. And so there was an unlimited supply of manpower for the guerrillas to draw from, whereas the Rhodesian army had a very limited supply, a limited source. Now, I would introduce at this point the fact that there were 2 full black African battalions that the Rhodesians had recruited. Now, these guys did not get drafted, although the Europeans did have a draft like we had in Vietnam. You had to serve 2 years. It's called national service. So every kid who turned 18 had to do their 2 years in the Army or Air Force. The Rhodesian government did not draft blacks. They did not draft Africans. There were Africans who volunteered to fight for the government. And in fact, as I said, there were 2 full battalions of what they called RAR, or Rhodesia African Rifles, who were formed. And these were it's an all volunteer force for these guys. And a lot of these guys, if you can bring that map up again, but I'll show you exactly where these guys were recruited from mostly. But that gave, okay, if you go down to go up a little bit from there, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the left, a little bit more, right there. Okay, where you see that top finger, that's it, the middle finger going up, figuratively speaking, of course. That was an area called the Bakita. That was a Bakita tribal trust land. That was an area that the guerrillas concentrated on and murdered more people in that tribal trust land, or TTL, than any other place in the whole country, because that's where some of those Africans, in fact, most of those Africans who joined the army came from. And so the guerrillas came in there and made those people pay. And they just murdered tens of thousands of people in the Bakita as a payback for those young guys joining the Rhodesian army. And it only inured the blacks who were in the government and fighting for the government to be even more brutal towards the guerrillas than the Europeans were. I mean, they killed your whole family. What are you going to do? You're going to go out and you're going to exact revenge in the worst kind of way. Well, if you go along this border go down to the upper Mozambique, right up to the upper top of Mozambique there along the border, okay, right there, okay, and follow that all the way down. There you go, all the way down to South Africa. All right, that border right there, all of that right down to the South African border in the bottom, that border was 800 miles. And that meant we had to guard, and watch for infiltrations along an 800-mile border alone. Then you have the Zambian border up on the top there, and that was about 150 miles. And then you had the Botswana border on the left-hand side, and that was about 500 miles. You can see how much territory there was for this government with their 50,000 men to try to stop the infiltrations from. And the thing is, those 50,000 that were in the Rhodesian services were not all combat, as you well know. In fact, the ratio, and Bud, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the ratio is about 3 to 1. 3 support troops for every 1 combat, or is that 4 to 1? Is that about the right ratio?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you've got people in who are armorers. You have supply. You have intelligence.
Mechanics.
I'm sorry.
Mechanics.
And mechanics were exactly. Mechanics were a huge part of that services. You're exactly right, because of all the landmines. So that meant there were only about 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 men in that entire army who were operational. And that was divided between the Rhodesia African Rifles, those 2 battalions. There was 1 battalion of Rhodesia Light Infantry, which was all European. There was the Special Air Service, which was a squadron, which was only about 300 men. And then you had as I said, the Rhodesia Light Infantry, and you had the Selous Scouts, which is a group that I later joined, and that was about 300 men. So there were, at the time, about 1,000, close to 1,000 rather, if you took support and all that. So here you can see that the huge differential in manpower. And when I got over there and I saw what this situation was like, I mean, I had a pretty fair understanding of what I was getting into, because it was, I just wasn't quite ready to hang the AK-47 and the M16 and the M14. I wasn't ready to hang all that stuff up. I was 29 years old and I was single at the time. And I thought, I'm sort of drifting. I can go to graduate school, but I don't really want to go now. So what I want to do is I'm going to go over there and take my shot at one more combat tour and see where it leads. And so I arrive over there in the midst of this mess of a political system where you have the 2 sides drawn tightly. Black nationalists on the one side, and remember, the moderates have now been pushed aside. There's no more moderate faction in the guerrilla army and guerrilla political leadership. Those people are long gone. And then you have the people on the right, on the other side, who are Europeans with some African sympathizers. And they're squared off in just a fiercest, bloodiest confrontation you could possibly imagine. It was all guerrilla warfare, all. There wasn't anything conventional about this war. And it helped me that I'd had the kind of training that I had in the Marines, working particularly in reconnaissance units, which is what a lot of that war in Rhodesia was about. You didn't operate in company size over there. There was no need for it. The bush was too big, and the guerrillas were way, way, way too wily and sneaky to be caught in big units. And so we didn't operate in anything larger than about a squad, maybe 10, 12 men. And that's what that war had devolved into. Small unit confrontations all over the country. It was rare that you had these big, big operations. But the fact is that almost as soon as I got there, these training camps in Mozambique and Zambia were pushing out these guerrillas. You had on the one side, and if you looked at that map again, you don't have to bring it up again. If you looked at that map again, in Mozambique, that army, that guerrilla army that was being trained over there was called ZANLA, Z-A-N-L-A. That's it. And in Mozambique, there you go. Those camps were situated in Mozambique. Well, of course, the guerrillas couldn't begin and use training camps inside Rhodesia because they'd have been spotted and wiped out. So beginning about 1970, 71, the guerrilla leadership pushed all the training areas for ZANLA, Z-A-N-L-A, into Mozambique, not far from the border, usually only a couple of Ks from the border. Now, this army, this ZANLA army, was composed of Shona, S-H-O-N-A, Shona tribesmen, and that was about 80% of the population in Rhodesia. And that operated the Shona tribes. If you draw a line right down the middle of Rhodesia, from the top to the bottom, okay? If you go to the right-hand side, that was where most of your Shona lived. In fact, all of it, because the tribal warfare between the two groups that I'm going to mention was just fierce, unbelievably fierce. But that area, all on the right-hand side of the country, was sort of reserved, you might say, for the Shona-speaking people. And they composed that army called ZANLA, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army. On the other side of that line, right there on the left-hand side, you had people who came from the tribe called Ndebele. And they had their training camps up in Zambia. And that area just across the border was where this army was called ZIPRA, Zimbabwe Independent People's Revolutionary Army. Those Ndebeles were all trained in Zambia. Now, the tribal warfare between these two groups was something you had to see to believe. If you look at that demarcation line that Bud just drew from the top to the bottom, right down the middle, exactly, that was a sort of unwritten border between these two tribal groups, the Ndebele on the left and the Shona on the right. And for about 3 or 4 months, if you go up to the D in Rhodesia, right there, that was a town called Guerrilla. I was stationed there for about 6 months as an operations officer. And that area along the midline that Bud just drew was an area where these two groups would often meet one another. And they would have the most unbelievable blowouts. Now, they were, mind you, they were supposed to be cooperating to overthrow the government itself. But they didn't do that. Often those groups fought one another. And so we just let them go at it. So when I joined the Army, I joined something called the Rhodesian Light Infantry, which was a regiment of about, essentially a battalion of about 500 men. And was drawn into 1, 2, 3 commando and support commando. And then there was the base group. So each of those commandos composed about 100 men, broken down into platoons or what they call troops. So I came over there in August of August of 76, and I was assigned as a troop commander in 3 Commando of the Rhodesian Light Infantry. It's funny, when I got over there, and I interviewed, they weren't just going to take me sight unseen. I mean, I sent them my resume and so on, but I had to sit for an interview when I first arrived. And this was a sort of a board of about, there must have been 10 or 12 officers. We were in sort of an auditorium, and it was a very sort of Spartan atmosphere. They had these sort of circular desks like this, or chairs, tables, where these officers were sitting behind. And then I was sitting in just a chair about 25 feet in front of them. There was, I think they wanted that kind of utilitarian atmosphere so that you were a little bit on the defensive there. I mean, there's nothing you could grab onto. If I started crying, there was no way to hide it. All the pressure got to me. I was going to start crumbling or so. They wanted to make sure that you could withstand at least some pretty close interrogations about your background. And so that's what I did. So I got in there, and these officers they weren't adversarial. It wasn't that kind of an interview, but they really did want to know if I'd done what I'd done, because they had about 4 or 5 officers who were pretty well versed in special operations. In fact, a couple of those guys had even been trained in the United States at jungle warfare school down in Panama, so they knew their business. And so they'd ask me things about what I did in Vietnam. And they were particularly interested in the force recon side of things, because that's where you get parachute trained, that's where you get scuba trained, you go through amphibious warfare school, and it's a kind of training that their specialized units over there, particularly in the Selous Scouts and the SAS, also got cross-trained in. A lot of those guys did scuba diving, a lot of those guys did free fall training. Of course, everybody was parachute qualified. So they asked me a lot about the contours of force recon work in Vietnam. And that was right down my alley. So that went off okay. And then they wanted to know a bit about my infantry training and how well, I wasn't in combat with infantry. I was in combat with reconnaissance. So there's a slightly different approach in your training. But they were interested in the 3.5 years I spent as an infantry officer, which would transfer nicely into Rhodesia. So anyway, that interview took about hour and a half or so, and they were extremely thorough. Then they asked me, which is really interesting, they asked me where I wanted to go. Well, in those days, you could not join the Selous Scouts right off the bat. In fact, a lot of that regiment, the Selous Scouts, was not even publicly acknowledged by the government. It's as though they existed, but people didn't hear about them in the newspapers or on the radio or anything like that. That work was so highly classified. But people knew about the SAS, Special Air Service, and the Rhodesia Light Infantry. And they said, well, you've been infantry and you're reconnaissance and blah, blah, blah. What do you want to do? We can send you to SAS to go on selection there, or we can send you to the Rhodesia Light Infantry. I thought, the SAS works in really small teams, which is precisely what I did in Vietnam. I kind of wanted to get away with that, and that's why I joined the infantry as an officer. So I said, well, could I go to the Rhodesia Light Infantry? And they said, absolutely. And 2 days later, I was over there. I had my troop, and the day after that, I went out. So I've been in Rhodesia for 72 hours, and they dropped me into a combat zone, and I took over a platoon of about 30 men. And we went on something called Fire Force Operations there, which was a fascinating approach to counterinsurgency. It was drawn from, oddly enough, the Marine vertical envelopment platform, where you'd insert Marines into the jungle, into the bush, and then you would have a group of helicopters, gunships, flying around the area to make sure that this team was safe on its insert. And until they disappeared into the jungle, you would have top cover on these things called a vertical envelopment. Now, if you got into trouble, of course, they would have these gunships flying around atop you. There you go. Very good. Excellent. Bud, you are the man. I got to tell you, you got this stuff right on top. Well done. We're going to send you a lollipop for this. This is first class. So this is what happened. You have the men on the ground, which you see down there, and you have these aircraft that are flying. Those are the gunships, right? Excellent. Those are the helicopter gunships. Now, if they had to throw an airstrike in because the ground combat got too intense, they would pull the choppers out of the area. Okay, so and then they would that bird you went to right there on the top, right above it, right? That's called an OV-10, which was an observation bird, and that would communicate with those jets on the left. Those are Hunter aircraft, Hunter jets. And what that OV-10 would do would be to fly around in a circle and direct airstrikes onto those ground targets. And he would shoot white phosphorus onto a target to mark it. And then once he got marked, he would fly off about 2 Ks away and let these jets hit this target. And they would fly in a kind of 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock pattern, where the 6 o'clock was down and would hit the ground as the other jet was on top cover. And as that jet pulled out from the ground, the other jet was coming down, and then it would throw its strike in just as soon as the other jet was 12 o'clock. And they would circle around like this over the combat zone until the target was exterminated. All the while where this OV-10 up here would be directing the strikes. All right, that was good. You got to drop 500, go right 200, and so on. But that was how these airstrikes worked. And it worked like that in Vietnam. And the Rhodesia Army had taken that same approach that the Marines had used in Vietnam and used that right there. Now, these men you see jumping out at parachutes right here on the left-hand side, that bird on the top right there, that down the back, is called a Dakota. That was a DC-3 or a C-47 in the military parlance. That was an old aircraft that was introduced to the U.S. forces in the 1930s, I think, wasn't that, Bud?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, 1930s. And it had been around that long. Well, the Rhodesians had bought a lot of these DC-3s on the black market. And so they used that as their paratrooper deployment. And so what would happen is you'd have a team that got into contact on the ground. This Dakota would come in and drop these paratroopers in, as you see right there. This is a great graph you've got here. And those paratroopers would get on the ground and then fight their way into the mix, where they would join the teams that were in contact on the ground. And so doing that, while they were doing that, and let's say the jets had now departed, you would have a K car, which is called a kill car. And this was a chopper that was the command vehicle for the commander in the Fire Force operation. And he would fly around in a circle around the combat zone, and he would direct where these men are to attack. And what they would try to do is they would try to encircle the guerrilla forces that were on the ground. So you'd have on one hand, you'd have the choppers that had gone in, and they would deploy men in what were called stop groups, or 4-man stop groups. And they would try to deploy these 4-man stop groups in a circle or a half circle around the guerrillas that had been sighted. And then the other paratroopers that came in would form the other half of the circle. So you would have try to completely surround these guerrillas and then work your way in from all spots of the perimeter and fight your way towards one another, trapping these guerrillas inside. Okay, well, how did you find the guerrillas in the first place? How did you even know they were there? Well, if you go to the left there, that graphic on the very left, Bud's got that drawn up right there. That's it, just on the top there. Right there you go. There'd usually be what's known as an observation post or an OP, often with Selous Scouts on there. Very small team Selous Scouts, usually 3 or 4 men. And they would have seen these guerrillas walk into this village at the bottom. So they were up there on an OP. They would use these 750 binoculars, and they would observe guerrillas walking in from the thick bush into this village to get fed. And then once they spotted those guerrillas walking into that village, they would call back to the Rhodesia Light Infantry headquarters and say, all right, we've got a sighting. They'd give the grid square. Fire Force would get in these choppers. So they had the troop carriers, which are called G cars or general service cars, and they would put a 4-man stop into each one of these. And they'd usually have maybe 4 of these available. So there were 16 men. I know this sounds really lightweight compared to the battalion and regimental size operations we had in Vietnam. But remember, this was a small army, and we were fighting small contacts usually with groups of about 10 or 12 guerrillas. And so putting 4 men in 8 and 6 and 12 men on the ground was not getting them, killed unnecessarily. But the G cars would then drop these troop ships. They would then drop them into these spots around the village. Maybe right there, there's one spot, and there's another one right there. Good. And then you go to left, and there'd be another one there. Okay, and then there would be another one maybe to that team's left. So you would drop these 4 or 5 G car stops around the guerrillas on one side right there, and then while they were being dropped, the C-47 would come in and they would drop paratroopers on the other side of the village. So what you would end up doing is having the village encircled with G-car troops on one side and paratroopers on the other side. And then you would, as I said, you would close in. And the gunship, the K-car, where the commander was sitting, would direct all of this traffic. And he would direct these stops as they moved in from one direction, another, and another as they closed into the center. And that K-car was armed with a 20 millimeter Matra cannon, which was a bad actor. These were firing HEs at the time. And not only did the shrapnel do you a number, but also the concussion from these things could kill you. And so that's how Fire Force worked. So an OP would be sitting up there on a hill. There you go. An OP would be sitting up on a hill, spying a group that goes into a village to get fed. They would call in to the Fire Force Operations Center, which was in the bush somewhere. There were Fire Force operations centers, throughout the country. And they'd call into the closest one. The ground commander of the Fire Force, which was generally from the Rhodesian Light Infantry, but the RAR also did Fire Force, would then put their men into these 3 or 4 choppers, 4 men a chopper, and then the gunship would take off and lead them into this contact area. And so once the guerrillas were spotted, the K-car gunner would throw out a red smoke. You remember when I told you last week about being trapped in the horseshoe, where the K-car, the lead gunship, would throw a smoke out if they saw NVA movement down there. Well, it's exactly how Fire Force operated. The G-car gunner would drop the smoke out. That's it. There's your 20 millimeter Matra cannon right there, belt fed. And that seat behind the cannon is where the gunner sat. Okay, to the left of that, right there on the very left, a little further left, a little further left, a little further. That's it. That's the seat where the K-car commander sat. That's the Army commander. He would sit there, so he could see right out. And then just to his right, if you go up a little bit to the right, there you go. That's where the pilot sat. So this is a 3-man gunship. And they would fly around this area until they saw the guerrilla movement. That K-car gunner would throw the smoke out, and the OP would look at that and say, right, you're spot on. Or, all right, go 200 meters to the north. That's where we saw him. Go 300 to the left, to the west. That's where we saw him, and so on. And once the K-car commander, this Army commander, saw what he thought was movement down there and had a pretty good idea that there were guerrillas in the area, he would then call in the G cars, and they would then start making their semicircular drops around that spotted area. And then if it need be, then they drop the paratroopers on the other side. And that's how a Fire Force operation worked. And the Fire Force ended up killing something like 80% of all the guerrillas in that war. The Zanla and Zipra, they're obviously taking a lead dog out. The guerrillas lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 killed in action. That's a you consider that we lost about 60,000 men in Vietnam with a population of 250 million. And that war still has scars. 60,000. The guerrillas lost 40,000 in a population a fraction the size of the United States, only 6 million people. Every family, there was surely every family in the country whose sons, left for guerrilla training. Virtually every family was affected by having lost someone, or noted in their village having lost 2 or 3 men who were killed in action that were fighting, against us. So the casualty rate that the guerrillas suffered was absolutely extraordinary. On the other hand, in that entire war that lasted from 68 to 80, 12-year war, the security forces lost about 1,500 killed in action. So you took that ratio of 40,000 to 1,500, and you can see what the kill rate was in that war. The kill rate in Vietnam was about 10 to 1. This was over 20 to 1 in Rhodesia. About 20 would be about 25 to 1 or so. So every man we lost, we took a good 25 of them with him. And that's why there was so much bloodletting in that country. So you'd have fire force that operated, sometimes there were 2 fire forces operating at the same time, all drawn from either the Rhodesia African Rifles, and Bud had put that up a few minutes ago, that shot of all those African soldiers. Those guys came from the RLI. And then the other shot of the Europeans jumping out that came from, or the RAR, I'm sorry, that group came from the RLI because those people were Europeans. And that's how that war pretty much was fought throughout its entirety. Fire force, internally and externally, there would often be airstrikes that were launched against a lot of these camps because sometimes they were just too far inside the country to put ground troops on operations. And that's what I joined. Excuse me. So for the better part of 2 years, I was on Fire Force operations. And it could get dicey, as you can imagine, particularly when you're working in long grass, elephant grass at 6-8 feet high. You never knew what was coming up in front of you. You'd have to, up in the northeastern area, they had a lot of caves. And I'm telling you, there's nothing that'll set your heart rating faster than climbing and crawling into a cave blind, because there's no light in there. And you've got 3 or 4 guys with you, and you hear movement about 15, 20 feet away, and you just know it's them, but nobody can see anybody. And there's just this pell-mell firefight inside a cave, trapped inside a cave that's sometimes no bigger than the bottom floor of an average house. It was awful. And if a direct round didn't get you, the ricochet would. And why we didn't lose more men over there, we lost our men, believe me, but why we didn't lose more men killed in cave fighting is beyond me. Guerrillas lost a ton of people in caves. Generally, they try to pick one, excuse me, that had an exit to it, but sometimes you had a moronic group that went in there without that kind of outback and outlet, and so they got trapped in there and they were all killed. There wasn't a lot of fighting around water areas because there wasn't much water in that part of the country, in that part of Africa. So we didn't really work with scuba operations that much, and we didn't have boat drills or any of that. But in bush fighting, it was almost all small unit engagement of 4 or 5 men here and maybe 8 or 10 of them there. And now in the big operations, we'd put in entire commandos, which happened a couple of times. And Bud alluded to the fact that there were groups that were situated across borders where they got trained. Well, we did the same thing, except instead of attacking with a small group of maybe 12 men, we attacked with an entire commando of 100. And we'd do the same thing. It was fire force on a much larger scale, where we'd put men in maybe 50 or 60 or 70 would go in by choppers, and the other 50, 60, or 70, whatever, would be dropped in by Dakotas. But the principle was the same. It was in a development that came vertically and trapped these guerrillas inside what effectively was a big circle. And then once the men were on the ground and situated, they would close up. Now you can imagine how difficult it was running an operation like this, because every group had a different call sign.
Oh, yeah.
And it was up to the Army commander who was in the K card to remember where all of these men were and what their call signs were. So it's a very complicated in that respect. Now, if you had stopped your movement, maybe he'd call everybody to stop in place. You would put out this very large, usually a 3-foot by 3-foot air panel that was either in that burnt orange or in red, and you'd lay that out in front of you on the ground so that if the K car flew over you and saw men down there, they wouldn't open fire because they'd know if you had an air panel out, you were friendly. And we never lost a man in that war due to friendly fire in that respect. There were men who were killed by friendly fire, but never on a K car, never on an operation like that, because guys knew once they stopped for any length of time, they put that air panel out, and that told the choppers above that you weren't going to die that day. And then once you got moved again, once you started moving again, you'd pack it up and you'd start on your sweep again. So that's pretty much how Fire Force worked. OP would spot a group, Fire Force would come in and lay a huge circle around it and then close in. And it was, as I said, when you talk about 8 out of 10 guerrillas who were killed in that war were killed using that particular tactic, then you can see how effective Fire Force was.
We've, if you wouldn't mind, we've kind of gotten a little bit into it to where some questions and stuff can come up. If you wouldn't mind if we hit you with a few questions before we start moving on with
Sure.
some stuff with the RLI. Let's see. Mary Jo, this was an interesting because getting into not only reading your book about jumps, aircraft, and if you would, maybe with this, you could speak to the difficulties Rhodesia were facing with the international community and how y'all were able to get weapons and this and that and able to get it considering sanctions and whatever they were doing to y'all. But Mary Jo was wondering about did you encounter U.S. weapons, aircraft in Rhodesia that may have been sold to Rhodesia directly or indirectly by Vietnam or maybe by the Israelis or anything like that?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. That goes to sanctions busting. Once Rhodesia was declared an outlaw state by the United Nations, and that was under the Carter administration. So that happened not long after I got there. Rhodesia was pretty much frozen out of the arms market, and so you had an entire industry within the country who did nothing but go abroad and try to find weapons that they could buy on the black market to send to the Rhodesian security forces. And I met a guy just after I arrived who had just been to Virginia, and he knew a lot about tobacco, and he was at a tobacco auction in Richmond, and he saw what he spotted immediately as Rhodesian tobacco, which had been smuggled into the country and was sold in Richmond for P. Lorillard, which has its headquarters down there. And that tobacco was what was used in American cigarettes. That's how Rhodesia got a lot of its money abroad. They sold tobacco. They also were one of the world's leading chromium ore extractors. And you need chromium ore in order to harden steel. So of course it's an absolutely vital part of the steelmaking process. And you just can't make high grade steel without chromium. But the Rhodesians had that stuff in abundance, and so they would sell that on the black market and earn foreign exchange. They also had some of the best coffee and tea that I have ever tasted in my life. It was extraordinary. That came out of the eastern districts near the Mozambique border from these farmers. That stuff was smuggled out and sold on the black market. And the last thing that went was the beef. That beef was corn-fed. No antibiotics were used in that. It was the cleanest stock you have ever seen. And that beef was in high demand in Europe in particular. And so the Rhodesians would load these huge, about the equivalent of a C-141, if you know what the size of those things are. and they would load those things. They were big cargo masters, and they would load those things with tons and tons of beef from these Rhodesian ranchers, and then fly this up through Belgium and then into Europe and sell that beef on the black market and bring that foreign exchange back into Rhodesia. And that was what the country used in order to purchase weapons. And the funny thing is, that's an excellent question, because the lady brought up PAVN, PAVN, which was the Vietnamese name, another name for the Vietnamese army. Rhodesia, now mind you, this is in '76, so the war between the U.S. and Vietnam was over by then, been over for 3 years. And the Vietnamese had huge numbers, had tremendous numbers of American weaponry over there. And so who sells former American choppers to the Rhodesian government? The Vietnamese do, North Vietnamese. The people who won the war over there need the money. And so Rhodesia bought American choppers from communist Vietnam. And again, this is all done on the QT, because once that avenue was exploited, you would have international sanctions against the country selling to Rhodesia. So Rhodesia was able to smuggle in huge amounts of equipment and weaponry and all kinds of ammunition. All the ordnance came in, and they had their own homegrown industry, to be sure. So there was no question there about what they needed, what to get, because they could always find it on the black market. It cost a little more, but we never wanted for small arms, ammunition, any kind of ordnance, equipment. It was always at the ready. And we used something called we had weapons over there that used a 7.62 NATO caliber. So of course the ammunition was always ready, available. Some of our units in Selous Scouts carried AK-47s because they had to look like they were guerrillas themselves. So that was easy enough to come by, because we had, to be sure, we had tons of enemy equipment that we could use for clandestine operations or so. So in answer to your question, a lot of the armaments and a lot of the equipment came right out of the coffers of these countries that just needed the money. These are Selous Scouts right here, and you can see these guys. Some are carrying FNs right here. Oh, these guys are Fire Force. Excuse me. These guys are probably RLI. So they're carrying FNs. These are Belgian automatic rifles that use a 7.62 caliber, and the equipment, the radios were made in country. All the uniforms and the web gear were all made in country. So they, there was all kinds of stuff available if you were a soldier.
And I need to go ahead and thank Andy's Gasworks, who's like me with MACV-SOG, but with Rhodesia, and some of these photos I'll be showing of guys in the field, the colored photos are from him. But we've kind of sticking on the weapons issue. That's always a big topic with guys, much like Vietnam weapons, Force Recon and SOG using stuff. Let me get that off. I remember reading in your book, Browning high power pistols were floating around. There's a lot of great, Andy's got some, and I'm trying to get them up right now, but I thought I remembered hearing some of on some of the operations, some of the guys would actually use RPDs as well.
Yeah, here's a obviously guys in Selous Scouts. You can see by the badging that he has, and he's carrying a PKM right there, and that's a 7.62 long. That's a heavy weapon. They didn't use those too often. Mostly they used RPDs, which used a 7.62 short. But this thing weighed as much as this is probably a good 25-pound weapon. You've got a box magazine at the bottom with about, I don't know, what is that? What would that be, Bud? Would that be like 75 rounds or so?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, you're packing that. That's a lot of weight to be carrying out there on an operation. So the Selous Scouts didn't use PKMs. That's more of a stage. Obviously, it's a stage shot, standing tall and lean and mean and bad. But the Selous Scouts, when they worked in clandestine operations, they would carry RPDs because they were a little lighter, and of course the ammunition was a little lighter too.
There are some great, and I've got some RPDs to where they, like you said, they had the chopped, and they actually had the box drums on the RPDs that they made a special cloth canvas cover to where it wouldn't, like in Vietnam, they'd put vinyl off flooring in there to keep the shake rattle noise down. But y'all evidently made a cloth box magazine cover that completely negated any sound whatsoever.
How about that? And I didn't know that. That's why, as I said, Bud, you're the man. Definitely. That's that's equivalent of an M60 that we carried in that we used in Vietnam. Obviously, this guy's using 7.62 ammunition, all NATO rounds. This again was about a 25-pound weapon. Every Fire Force team of 4 men carried a machine gun. There were 3 FNs, automatic rifles, and the fourth man always carried an M60 or the equivalent of an M60. That gave that team a lot of firepower, and that's why they could hold off groups that were 2-3 times the size, because they certainly had, and they knew how to lay down bases of fire. The gunner would lie down on the ground, and if they had to go an assault, he would support 3 guys in an assault with ground fire as a base of operations. So we worked together all the time and trained that way, that we had in an assault pattern like that, you'd have the gunner stay down, and you'd have the 3 men rush a target or an enemy group while this guy was laying down a base of fire. Obviously, you had to coordinate this very well because that's a pretty high rate of fire. You fire 3-round bursts, bam, 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 bam. You don't go on, television or in the movies where they just fire, 500 rounds out of a 60-round drum or whatever. So the gunners were really, really well trained on handling these weapons and supporting these small assault teams who went in and mixed it up with the guerrillas in very, very close combat.
That's, it's amazing. I've gotten, I forgot, and dang it, I'll look it up in just a second, but I've got a great document that one of the guys wrote on the Fire Force tactics in the field, and I've got so much stuff on this phone that it's going to take me a minute to find it, and I'll find it. But there was one other question. Well, there's going to be another weapon question, but were these the FNs you guys were using? Were they the all black that we just saw, or were y'all getting the? I think some of them had some wood on them as well.
Yeah, the FNs there. These were Belgian FNs that the government had bought in the late '60s. So that's before sanctions hit. But this guy has actually taped 2 magazines together, as you can see. So he's finished with one, and he flips it over, and then he's got another one right behind that. Those stocks were made out of it was a plastic base that was used for the stocks. The old FNs, first generation, used wooden stocks. You could tell a guy who'd been in the war for years if he was carrying around a wooden stock FN. And those were mostly, when I got there, those were mostly relegated to some of the police reserve units where they didn't really have first line weapons. But we got essentially brand new FNs. And I'll tell you, you will never have a stoppage with an FN. That thing was the cleanest firing weapon I've ever seen in my life. It reminded me so much of an M14 because that fired clean, unlike the 16s, which of course were notorious in the early days because they used terrible ammunition in the early days of Vietnam. And that's why you had so many stoppages over there. There you go. Good. Yeah, it's an old model FN right there. Early first generation type. I never saw one in the RLI. And you can even tell it's old because it's got a carrying handle right there on the top. The newer ones didn't have that model.
Did you with I know you used and I've just gotten those that RPD pick I wanted to show you, but what was out of all the weapons you used, what was your favorite weapon in Rhodesia that you used, machine gun wise? Well, I guess pistol wise, what was your favorite in all your years that you came across?
You know, I the Browning 9 mil was what was issued standard issue for officers over there, but I didn't have a Browning mil. I took a 45 semi-automatic Colt 45 with me over there, and so I carried that 45, and I brought about 1,000 rounds with me. Hollow points, there were Super Bell hollow points that I used. Um, so I was the only person I knew. A couple of Americans had brought 45s with them also, but I'd qualified pretty well in the Marines with that, and I could shoot pretty well with that. So I was very comfortable with that. But most of the Rhodesian officers carried the Browning 9 mil, which was a good weapon. I mean, there's no question about it.
Oh, it's with the Saw guys. I mean, that's that was their weapon of choice if they could get it. And heck, their prestigious silver pistol award was a chrome plated Browning high power. So it was revered by them as well. There was
Well, not only that, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean
no. Go ahead, sir. That's
the,
fine.
the 45 only had a 7-round magazine with one in the
Mhm.
chamber. I mean, you had only 8 rounds. That was sort of one of the drawbacks there. And a 9 mil, I think it had
Third,
15,
uh,
15 in the magazine and one in the
it may have
something
been
like
13
it's like
plus
12 or
one. I think 13 plus
13
one.
plus one. Okay, 13 plus one.
Mhm.
So you have almost 1.5 times the amount of ammunition with the 9 mil as you did with a 45. But you get trained on a weapon and you kind of take that to heart. Oh yeah,
He's got a pistol grip. That's the first one in Rhodesia. That's the shortest RPD I've ever seen, and the
that,
first time I've ever seen a pistol grip off a
yeah,
16 or an FN on one.
yeah. That's the shortest. I've never seen it. I've never seen RPD look like that. That drum, you could put 75 in, but I think the recommended number was about 71. You didn't want to pack it up to the hilt there because
Um,
you might that spring might deactivate on you. But he's got the stock chopped off
eh,
and got a modified with a handle on it. He needs a handle. I mean, those things would lift on you. So you need to. Oh yeah,
there's
how
one
about
with the
that?
bag that I was mentioning earlier, and
Yeah,
once I found
yeah.
out about that, that hooked me. And again, Andy's Gasworks guys on Instagram is he's like me with Rhodesia, and this is the first time. This is the shortest RPDs I've ever seen in Rhodesia, or RPDs were in Rhodesia, I should say, to clarify that. And then finding out that y'all custom made pouches to cut down on the rattle and glimmer in the sunlight and everything is
Hmm.
just a whole nother level of
Hmm.
gamesmanship, shall we say.
Yeah.
um
Each year, guerrillas usually worked in sections of about 9 or 10 men, and they all carried AKs except one guy might have an RPD. Generally, they would have one guy in a section with an RPD, and and a lot of those guys would carry AKMs, the M at the end of AK. That meant that there was a piece of the end of the barrel right at the muzzle that was chopped off at an angle. So if you had a straight barrel, you'd take about a half inch or an inch behind it and you would chop a piece off at an angle. So it sort of came, you wouldn't chop it this way, but sort of at an angle downward, where if you looked at it from the top, you would actually see the inside of the barrel itself, the muzzle. And what that did was it kept an AK from lifting when you fired it. And those AKMs were highly sought after by Selous Scouts in particular because there was no recoil upward like this. You could put a 3-round group at 100 yards the size of an orange with absolutely no recoil at all. And that's what those AKMs were useful for. So they were they were hard to find, but if you got one, you kept it.
um but one last question for me, and then I'll get to the viewers. I'm sorry guys, I told y'all I was going to be learning just as much off of this as you guys are. I was always curious because, again, this guy Andy is absolutely amazing, and since you had quite a few jump experiences, shall we say, this is the first time, and I don't know why Sog did not think of this, but he was saying that all of the jumpers, I don't know if maybe you can identify if they are RLI or Selous, or I don't even know if it's SAS, but
No, yeah. These
the
guys
guys,
are, these guys are RLI. Those are motorcycle helmets they're wearing up on the top there.
oh,
And we would jump with weapons. There were some countries, I think, that probably don't do that. What you're pointing at right there is a 9mm.
mm-hmm.
And what these guys did, that's on his reserve, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they are using T10s as mains, but these reserves, these are all American shoots, incidentally. And they busted Sanctions to buy all these shoots, too, which is pretty cool. But what happened was this guy would hook his reserve up in front with a 9mm strap there. You know, we jumped out. Combat height was only 500 feet when we went out the door. Sometimes you would be jumping into guerrillas that you didn't even know were down there, and they'd be running below you at all. This guy would have a pistol there at the ready, so that if there was anybody near him as he was dropping, he would be able to pull this out and fire on the way down. I couldn't tell you how many men I had of mine who actually did that, because they once Fire Force got in the air, this guerrillas would generally scatter, or what we call bombshell, and sometimes they would run right under you. They'd be firing at you or not. Maybe they dropped their weapons, maybe not. Maybe you had some tough guys down there who wanted to stick around for a fight. But either way, when you patched a 9mm onto your chute, you had that. At least you had that coming down where you weren't completely helpless. So what you would do is you would strap these weapons to your side, and you would jump with these things. And you tried not to land on your right side, obviously, because if you landed on your right side, that thing would land on your hip, and you'd have a bruise that would go right to the bone. That could last for a month. And some of these guys made 2 jumps a day, combat jumps a day. So you can imagine how painful that could be. You always tried to land on your left side if you feet together, obviously, but you made a point to try to do at least that much so you weren't incapacitated for And if you even had a bone bruise that would literally dent your bone, the Rhodesians didn't want to hear about it. Just get up there and jump, all right? Don't be a jerk, just jump, all right? That's what you're getting paid, a pittance for every month. If you don't like it, go out and, be a supply clerk or something.
That was one thing I was so interested seeing. He did a special thread showing guys with their in case they got hung up or needed to come down shooting. I thought that was one of the smartest things that you can and easily do. And I don't know why SOG never did that. I guess they thought they could do it and snoop and poop and not even land amongst people. But I thought that was absolutely genius. And then, talking about the jumps, before we get to the next part, I forgot. I think I may have been talking to Andy about this, these guys, and he said one of the Selous Scouts or RLI guys ended up with like 500 or 700 jumps by the time the war ended. Practice and combat wise.
I don't know if it ever got that high. I knew of a couple of guys in my commando had 70 and 80 combat jumps, where they jumped literally into action. I didn't know. I had probably 20 at the time, but these guys had 5-6 times the amount I did. And with training and jump and combat and so on, you might have gotten guys with a couple of hundred, but I never heard anybody getting 700 or 800, unless not operational. So I'm not sure where that came from. Now this is the RLI, and they are getting ready to get onto that Dakota, and you can see the guy in the front has an MAG, machine gun, Belgian, strapped to his side. And then the rest of those guys are all carrying FNs, and they're all taped to their sides too. And they got their mains in the back, and then you can see the hands on the reserves. So what you do is you have the jump master, of course, go down the line and check each man's equipment, and he'll go down there, and then you put 24 men onto one of these Dakotas, 12 aside. And so what would happen is the pilot would hear from the K-car commander. This is the Army commander who had his men on the ground. If he wanted another set of men to jump in, he would contact the pilot on the radio and say, "All right, I put a smoke down. I want you to put your people here." So the pilot would then radio back to the door guy, and this would be the jump master who's looking at these guys. That guy would be standing right in the door there, and he would be told by the pilot, "Okay, let's get him up." So the red light would go on the ceiling of the aircraft itself, and the jump master would say, "All right, stand up." So you'd stand up and you would turn and face the door right to this edge right here. And then he would say, "Check equipment." And so you would look at the man's, now remember, you're standing behind a guy and you're only like a foot away from him. You would check his rigging in the back and make sure that his static line was securely fastened to the back of the parachute, and it did not go under his arm. That would be his left arm. It did not, because if you went out the door with a static line under your arm, you'd tear that muscle loose from your arm. It would wreck you. I had a guy do that. I had one of my men actually do that one time by mistake, and the bicep had been snapped and had risen up to his shoulder, and he had this huge lump up here where his muscle had been pushed up to his shoulder. It was the ugliest thing I've ever seen, and the poor guy had to stay in that, because it was a mean firefight we got into in Mozambique. He had to stay there overnight, and then he could only get medevaced out the following day. So we put him on some pretty heavy painkillers, and that's the only way he got through the night. So you'd be standing there, you'd check equipment, make sure the static line was properly rigged, and then the jump master would get a signal from the pilot, and he would say, the green light would go on, go, 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 and you would jump right behind the guy behind you. And so you could get 24 men out in about 10 seconds. And that's, you want to keep them close together, excuse me, because you don't want them separated on the ground. Now you see some of these training videos, and you'll see some sort of, B-grade movies and so on of a guy jumping, and then 2 or 3 seconds later, another guy out, and then 2 or 3, another guy out. Do you have any idea what the separation coefficient is on the ground between these men? It could be hundreds of yards, but with our guys, they would land probably only 30, maybe 20, 30 feet from one another, 40 feet, 50 feet. And that's how they did that's how we did excerpts and extracts. Jumps on combat jumps.
Before we go to further on down the line, because I've held up everybody, and I'm sorry, guys. I know most of them were from the cars, so to speak, and that's another thing, guys. I absolutely love the Afrikaan and the Rhodesian slang, and maybe Mr. John in a bit can give us some slang and all of that. I absolutely loved looking at some of this and saying, what in God's name are these men saying to Mr. John? But did y'all ever, at this point in time, either SAS, RLI, Selous Scouts, did y'all ever jump out of a Dakota or any bird or a fixed wing, or was it all rotary wing combat jumps?
All the jumps that were ever made over there were out of Dakotas, DC-3s.
Oh, okay.
Now, when I got trained, I got trained down in South Africa, and they trained us on C-130s down there. So we went out the back on those things, out the back, back ramp. So it was a different experience than jumping out of a Dakota, because that was side door as opposed to back door. But I mean, the principle is the same. You hook up and green light, go. Now, the thing about jumping out of a Dakota was was you think, oh man, I'm going to get hit by that tail. Well, the downdraft from that was you'd go out the door and you would be sucked under the tail itself. You could see that thing overhead. It was only about 6 or 8 feet overhead. And you just wonder why you're not going to get decapitated. It scared the living hell out of me the first time I did it. Um, and it, it's, I mean, you could almost like reach up and touch this tail. It was like, it felt that close. And you get the downdraft would shoot you down. And you had about, you had about 3 or 4 seconds to make sure your chute was deployed because you were in essentially a free fall for that 3 or 4 seconds, and you had to wait till a T-10 got deployed before you ever decided whether or not to pull your reserve. And it happened a couple of times. There were some guys got some Mae Wests and so on, so they had to they had to deploy their reserves, but it didn't happen often. We had our riggers over in the Paraloft who did a marvelous job. These were women who were with the Rhodesian Women's Service, RWS, who did all the packing and all the rigging.
Could you, before we go into the next thing, while we're on it, where did Rhodesia get their jump knowledge, their setup for a school? Was that from the Brits coming and the Aussies coming from the SAS and making all of this?
Exactly.
Or
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly what they did. They didn't have that capability early in the war. Fire Force didn't really come into itself until about the early 70s, and with it came this design to put more. How are you going to put more men on the ground if you don't have the choppers? Well, we'll jump them in, and so they had a lot of former British SAS and British Royal Marines who carried that knowledge with them and helped them train in that direction. And then of course, they were self-trained by the time I got over there.
That's yet another thing about the Rhodesians that you just gotta respect. Besides the whole world cut them off, them literally building an army from the ground up in the moment and doing all of this.
Yeah, they had a unique approach to war. That there was nothing, absolutely nothing that was structured. They would adopt a tactic from moonbeams if they felt it was a good, solid, war-born tactic, and they carried a lot of American ideas into their combat training because of how we did these vertical envelopments in Vietnam. And Fire Force was really an extension of an American idea. And they just modified it on their own, on the ground, and did whatever's necessary. With the lack of manpower, they said, well, the Americans have 4 trillion choppers over there, so they don't have to worry about jumping people in. We don't. So what do we do? Well, someone came up with this idea of the paratroopers there. So that's when Rhodesia started acquiring on the black market more of these Dakotas so that they could use them for Fire Force inserts. They were very adaptive. They were an extraordinary people. Flexible, unforgiving in terms of you messing up out there. You did that once, and it was sort of like the Marines. Your feet wouldn't touch ground. You would be pulled off combat status, and put in some desk job or something. It happened to plenty of people there who couldn't cut it. So they were very unforgiving in that respect. But they were a very funny people, but highly, highly adaptive, which is why they could hang on for so many years, being so badly outnumbered. They were as flexible as the day was long, and it always took the guerrillas by surprise when they put a new infantry Fire Force tactic into use, because it was something that the guerrillas not only weren't trained for, but in their training in these camps in Mozambique and Zambia, do you know that their instructors wouldn't tell them about Fire Force? Because they knew that if they knew what they were getting into, they would never have gone in to join the guerrillas in the first place. A lot of those guys came in completely blind. They had no idea what they were facing, because they were the leadership was dead set against scaring them and letting them know what their chances of survival were if they got spotted by a Fire Force. They were not, the chances of living through those were not good at all. If you got spotted by Fire Force, your chances were about 80% that you're going to get killed.
Oh yeah,
about 80%.
Could you Before we get into these last of these questions on the subject we're on, before we get into Selous Scouts, it seems like the perfect kind of opportunity to while we're speaking on this, could you kind of explain a little bit about the different ideologies between not only Zipra and Zanla, but also speak a little bit about, I mean, you're kind of experiencing NVA, not NVA, Vietnam War kind of issues here. You've got infiltrations coming in from the border that y'all are having to fight. You've got communist ideologies and training camps on the borders with people you just spoke about coming in. The cadre are lying. Could you speak a little bit about all of that and the differences in the training with Zanla and Zipra?
Yeah, that's a good insert right there. As I mentioned earlier, the Shona occupied sort of the right-hand side of the country, and about 80% of all African Rhodesians were of Shona tribal origins. The other 20%, that's good. Yep. The other 20% on the left-hand side of the map were Zipper, were Indabele. Those two tribes did not get along. In fact, they had fought one another for decades before this on a very sort of local scale, using sort of makeshift weapons, machetes and spears and so on. They didn't have weapons, obviously in the early part of the 20th century, but the Indabele always felt they were head and shoulders superior to the Shona. They carried themselves with this sort of regal reserve, that they were the tribe of kings, and being in the minority helped them with that kind of complex. They felt that they were the chosen ones. They were being victimized by Shona, and that they were much more able to fight. They were of a superior intellect. They were of a superior tribal origin, and so they really looked down, the Indabele did, upon the Shona in that sort of right-hand part of the country. And that is why, that's one of the major reasons why those groups did not get along well together at all. And they never coordinated operations against security forces because of that inherent jealousy on the part of those tribes about one another's status. And so it's a card that the government played, particularly in those central sections of the country, all the way up from the top of the Mozambique border through the Sonoya area, down through the Chilimanzi, which you can see at the right there, Chilimanzi, and on down to Bight Bridge. That sort of demarcation set the tone for these crossover fights between these two groups that took place throughout the war. And these farmers who would be, in the middle of the country, would often hear these firefights out there and call in through the Agrit alert to the local defense community and say, "Hey, what are you people doing out here? And you didn't tell us you were operating out here." And they said, "That's not us. Those are two groups going at one another." And it happened all the time in the Midlands, which is what this area was called, between the two sectors. I operated in Sonoya at the very top of the map there. I operated there. Did a lot of work in Umtoko to the right. That's where those caves were in particular. I worked in Umtali down on the right-hand side there on the border. Right-hand side, you go. A lot of operations in there. That whole eastern area from above Umtoko down the border. That area was devoted to a lot of farming, a lot of timber sources up there, and so on. Chilimanzi, I operated a lot through there, right, sort of a central part there to the left. There you go. Fort Victoria, which is Fort Vic, I did work in there. Ngundu Halt, down a little bit further. Ndanga, which was the tribal trust land to the right. A lot of Selous Scouts. I did a lot of work with Selous Scouts out of Chiredzi in the bottom there, and that whole eastern district I pretty much knew by heart. if you go to the right there, you see the Guerrilla Zoo. That's a game reserve. Now, there are a lot of camps that were to the right of that, about where the R is in Guerrilla Zoo. There you go. There's a big camp there. We hit that camp once in 78, and there were killed a lot of guerrillas in that camp, over a couple of hundred. And the people who survived that headed towards the border into the Guerrilla Zoo, and they weren't prepared for that, what they saw, which was nothing. The place is flat, arid, devoid of any sort of vegetation to speak of. I mean, you had a lot of acacia trees and so on, but baobabs and so on, but you didn't really have a lot of cover. No water at all. And some of these guerrillas just died of thirst on the way in. They were trying to get to Cherezi and then move up sort of north of that, but they'd get caught in the Guerrilla Zoo and they'd just die of thirst. It was an awful way to go. Just awful. Mind you, Bud, that while all of this was going on, Special Branch, which was the police, now it's a regular police that this is police intelligence units that was attached to Selous Scouts, used to poison clothing with various pesticides and then put the clothing into some of these remote stores in these tribal trust lands. And they worked with the store owners, of course, very, very classified as far as the store owner's identification went. And store owners would make sure that this clothing went only to the guerrillas when they would come in to usually steal, because they usually rob these stores. And they would put this in a separate section and make it available for them and take everything else off the shelves. And they would then take these pieces of clothing, wear them, and in about 2 or 3 days, their bodies would just start to disintegrate. They'd start bleeding out of every orifice, getting violently ill. Some of them would go blind, they'd go deaf, blood coming out of their nose and mouths. It was the most awful way to die you could possibly imagine, but they would be slowly poisoned. But they couldn't figure out that it was the clothing connection to the store that they had just robbed. And so that always left the store owners off the hook, and they were never lost one in this whole time. But there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guerrillas who got poisoned in this way before they ever really got into the country, because they'd only walk a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, and then they'd have to lie down, and their comrades there wouldn't shoot them. They'd leave them there and take their weapons. And then the problem after that was, as this guy is dying with all this blood around him, the hyena would come in. And they'd usually get these guys, and oftentimes they'd eat them while they were still alive. I mean, you can't imagine anything worse. You just can't imagine. And the reason we know this is because we would capture some of these guys who had been through this, and they heard stories of hyena getting, people that they had worked with. It was a rough life if you're going to be a guerrilla in Rhodesia. It was a rough life. And then say you survive that, the next thing you know is this: you got 10 tons of armament and aircraft coming down on you in fire force. And that's why the desertion rate among guerrillas was so extraordinarily high. We never went without intelligence. We always had people who were surrenders who would come across and say, "Look, man, I've had enough of this war. Thank you very much."
Could you talk a little bit about the complete different? They're both getting communist training, and one group's getting indoctrination, if you will. Could you kind of explain how the Russians differ? Their training differed from the Chinese training a little bit for these guys.
The Zanla, these are the people now. These are the Shona on the sort of I'll say right hand, left hand side of the country. I think it's easier to identify them that way. They were trained camps in Mozambique, and they were usually trained by. There were a lot of Cubans there and a lot of Russians there, in these camps in Mozambique. If one guy showed a lot of potential, he would be pulled out of the training cycle, and he could be sent to maybe Libya or Egypt, Tanzania, or even some would go to Vietnam. And if you were a political commissar, and every section had a political commissar, and this is a guy who juiced them up with the propaganda and so on, he would go probably to Vietnam, and he would train up there for a couple of months on the political side, and how to indoctrinate people and what the revolution was all about and so on. But the people with that kind of aptitude were few and far between. And it makes sense. I'm not trying to denigrate them. I'm just saying that would be the same with any army. Some people are brighter than others and have a gift for gab that others don't have. So they would go to these training camps. The ones that showed potential would usually be sent onward from Mozambique into these camps that I just mentioned. And they were highly indoctrinated by the Chinese and the Vietnamese in particular. Zipra, on the other hand, was mostly a Russian organization. I said there were Russians. There were Russians actually who advised both sides, but the Zipra recruits, the ones who showed that kind of potential, were generally sent to Russia itself, and they would go to Odessa and train there in these camps, and they do a lot of medical training would take place under Russian authority. And then they would be to Rhodesia after several months. Their camps, the general camps, were located in Zambia, and they were staffed a lot by the Russians themselves. But in those days, and they still have issues, but in those days, you had the Sino-Soviet split, which took place in 1960, and that persisted all through the 70s, where it was theoretical. It was a political split because Mao had felt that the Russians were not paying attention to Mark. They were too liberal, and he didn't like that at all. And so I'm minimizing this, and I'm brushing over it in a most unsatisfactory manner intellectually. But essentially, there was a political disagreement between the Russians and the Chinese that persisted throughout the war in Rhodesia. And so you found the Russians favoring the Zipra recruits. These are the Indobelli, and taking them up into Russian camps and so on. Whereas the Chinese would train most of their people in Mozambique, as I said, and then send the ones with potential into these camps in Libya and Egypt and so on, and Vietnam. So you had this ideological split between the two groups, but that was really marginal compared to this tribal hatred that existed and still exists between the Indobelli in the left-hand side or western part of the country and the Shona in the eastern part of the country. It was tribal before it was anything else. And that's why they couldn't cooperate during the war and unify their approach and fought two different wars, you might say, against the European community.
And didn't some of the I think it was the Russian guys, after y'all had come across, I mean, they were, frankly, utterly lied to about they were going to be getting jobs and stuff like that. And then I think you said one group was actually treated, they were utterly racist towards them, treated them like animals, basically.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The Russians were extremely racist, very racist. And, the Chinese feel as they're the most superior race on Earth. They always have. I mean, their culture goes back over 4,000 years, and to this day, they feel as though they are racially superior to any other race on the face of this earth, because their civilization has existed longer than even that of Egypt. The Russians, on the other hand, were racist in the sense of their being white and their training, and so there's a tremendous amount of racism on the part of these Indobelli groups that would go into Russia for training, and they complained about that mightily. They found it intolerable. I mean, people on the streets would taunt them with racial epithets and so on. They said it was just miserable, the ones we captured and talked to. So you had you had this disparity between these two groups where the Chinese, on the one hand, were subtly racist, and the Russians were overtly racist. So no matter where you went, these guerrillas would get it both ways. So that, let's just say they weren't doing these guerrilla groups any favors, in terms of friendship and so on. They were in it really for themselves because they wanted that white government overthrown so they could plant their feet in Southern Africa. A lot for the minerals too. That's what a lot of them were after.
Oh, yeah, much like today with what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful book, not only because it covers a lot of your actions and but you do a great job of giving an overall history of not only Rhodesia before you get into Rhodesia, but actively going through situations that are unfolding in real time, affecting oncoming operations or things that happen that produce an operation from that incident occurring. And it just seems like it's just a revolving door of stuff that's coming up for y'all. Much like you said, you've got so much to defend with so many
Sure.
men that that y'all have got at y'all's disposal. I know we're here at an hour and a half now. We've not really gotten into the scouts very much. What made you, or what brought on your feeling that you were wanting to leave the RLI and go into the scouts now?
That's a good transition question. I had, when I was with the RLI, I got into a bit of a tiff with a new commando commander. The guy's name was Major Snelgar, and he and I did not get along from the get-go. I was a senior first lieutenant, or a full lieutenant, as they termed them. In fact, I was a senior lieutenant in the battalion, and he and I had some big differences. He wanted his own man in there. I was the second in command of the commando. He wanted his own guy in there. It was pretty clear. And so he engineered my transfer from the RLI to an operations position in Guerrilla. He was not. I mentioned this guy in the book. In fact, I cover him quite a bit. He was not the best commander around. He ended up getting killed in an external operation. He was in a chopper that flew into a set of power lines, killed the whole crew, and down he went. But I can just tell you, he'd been at the School of Infantry in Guerrilla. He was a training officer for a long time. His best friend down there was another training officer, and he wanted this guy in, as I said, as his 2IC, second in command. Well, it turned out that this guy ended up getting relieved of his command about 4 months after he arrived and took over my position. He got relieved for cause. He just made some bad decisions out there in the bush, and they yanked his butt up right there on the spot. And then this guy proceeds to get himself killed. So it left a huge vacuum in that commando. Anyway, I go out to Guerrilla. I'm a senior operations officer down there for 6 months, and I say, holy moly, I didn't come over here to push pins in maps. I just didn't do that. So I called a friend of mine, Rich Passportis at Selous Scouts, and said, man, I want to come across. I want to go on selection. So he said, well, you're just in luck, big boy, because we've got one coming up in 2 weeks. And they're only like 4 held a year. I thought, holy moly, man, that gives me 2 weeks to train. So I hung the phone up, and I got my ARVN. Remember, I showed you that ARVN pack I had last week. I used that pack, and I put a 30-pound sandbag in it. And then I went on these 10-mile runs every day. And then I looped a big, thick rope over a beam in one of the aircraft hangars that was this is an air base that I was at. And I do these climbs, these rope climbs, about 15 or 20 a day, because that's what you had to do on selection. And I did other bits of training and so on. So anyway, 2 weeks later, I went on selection, which was if they had told you they were going to murder you before selection began, you'd probably believe them. It would have been a good idea to believe them, because that's what they ended up doing. They wouldn't feed you at all for the first 4 days. This was up in a place called Lake Kariba, which was hot. God, it's hot and dry, and it was just awful. They'd give you all the water you needed, obviously, for, I mean, you're in that kind of environment, but they wouldn't feed you for the first 4 days. And I mean, burning up the number of calories that we were burning up with no food just took a massive toll on people. So there were 115 people in my selection. And after the first 4 days, I think there were like 40 of us left. Guys just dropped out. You could come from any unit in the Army to be in Selous Scouts. They were very, very open-minded about that. And you had volunteers from the Rhodesia African Rifles. You had police volunteers. You had guys from the RLI, guys from the independent companies that were like reserve companies that were in the bush. You had them from all over. So after the first 4 days, 5 days, we were down to 40. Then they started feeding us, but we would still have these drills, these training drills, and so on. We'd have a 90-pound Mapani log. 2 guys would have to carry this on their shoulders. So I brought a T-shirt and I put it on my shoulder, and you got another guy at the other end. They're about 10 feet long, and they all weighed 90 pounds. They made sure of that. And we'd go on these log runs every morning, and you'd probably run about 3/4 of a mile with this on your shoulder. Then you'd hand it over to another set of 2, and they'd run about 3/4 of a mile. Then a third group, and then back to you again, and you'd run another mile or whatever it was. And then in the middle of all of this, they'd sit you down with this log, and there'd be 4 men on the log itself, and we'd have to do these sit-ups with this log coming up and down and up and down. And we'd probably do 200 or 300 of those this is every morning now, before we even started our day. Then they'd have the man lift up the hill. There was a hill about probably 200, 300 feet high, something like that, sloped. And we would have to carry a guy, our weight, on our shoulders up this hill, all the way to the top. And then we'd have to carry him back down again on our shoulders. Then this guy would reverse positions, and he'd have to carry us up. And you were timed on this. You couldn't hesitate. And then carry him back down, and do that about 4 or 5 times. Then you'd have in the afternoon, you have the ropes course, which was an obstacle course made strictly of ropes. And they'd have strung these things across ravines, and the ropes were probably 3 inches thick, something like that in diameter. And you would have to crawl on this, hand crawl with this thing between your legs. And they didn't have a safety net on this. And this was like a 30-foot fall into bush. And there were guys that fell and almost got killed. They got knocked off selection because they got hurt so badly. But they tell you better hang on, or you're going to get yourself really hurt. And you had to crawl on that. And then you'd have like a monkey bridge. You'd have to hand your way across that. Then you had this rope swing. Then you had to swim through this muck and junk, and then do it all over again. So you'd have a ropes course, and you'd have a double running of the ropes course. And the problem was, the first time the whole ropes course was dry, so you got good grips on the ropes themselves. But the second time, everybody had been through all this muck, and the ropes were now slick, and you couldn't hang on to anything. And so the slippage rate was just astronomical, and it's just where a lot of people got hurt. But they didn't care, man. They just said, you're going to do this or else. Anyway, we had a week and a half of that every day. And then the last 4 days, we had something called the Endurance March, where we put 55 pounds of rocks in our packs, along with all our food and water, ammunition, and so on. And we have to hump about 20 Ks a day, about 15 miles a day, up the hills and down the hills, and up the hills and down the hills. Now, I went through November, which is they're in the southern hemisphere, so November was the middle of the summer. There's about 110 out there most days, and you got to do all this stuff in this heat. You got to march 15 miles in this heat with all your equipment, and the rocks would probably be about 75 pounds. I mean, you had to carry an FN, that was another 10. Magazines made it 12. Ammunition, food, water, on top of 55 pounds, and so you were humping about 80. And it was just murder. By the time we finished, we ended up with 20 guys past selection. Very, very high rate. Very high rate. Most selections only got about 8 to 10%. passed. But we had a particularly good group, I guess you might say, or dedicated group, or certainly a group that anticipated working with a good unit, and that gave them an extra thrill to pass all these tests. And for officers, now I was a captain by this time, I got promoted. Officers had to do these exercises in the middle of the night, where they'd wake you up at you didn't get much sleep anyway. You'd probably go to bed on most days you'd go to bed around midnight, and you'd have to be up before first light, which is around 4:30. So you'd get maybe 4 hours sleep a night. But officers would be awakened sometime during those 4 hours, and they would give us a tactical problem. All right, and each problem differed. There were 4 of us who were officers on this. One got kicked off, and one dropped out. So they ended up with just 2 that passed. And they'd give us this situation, and you've got about 5 minutes to draw up a tactical order, and you've got to have your briefing set. You got to do all this in about 5 or 10 minutes, and then they'd run the problem, and they wake the men up too to do this, and then they'd give you another 45 minutes so to go back to sleep again. And they did that in that 2 weeks. I think I had to do that 3 or 4 times. One of the problems was where they had stretched a rope across a dirt road, and you had to figure out how to get all of your men, all of your weapons, and all your equipment across this road without leaving any marks on the road itself. How are you going to do this? And you just have to design a feature. You'd have to design a way to transfer these men across, and they give you all the rope you needed. Well, what I ended up doing was making a loop around the rope itself. So the rope ran this way, and I made a rope loop that looped around it with another, like a little hook on the end of it, fashioned it out of rope, and attached this to another rope at the other side of the road. And I'd get a man across on the rope. I'd have him crawl across, and then he would pull equipment on this rope all the way across the road. And then I'd pull up with another rope. I'd pull the empty loop back and transfer all the equipment that way across itself. Now you had to get your men across too. And so it was the same thing, was this rope climb of about 25 feet across this dirt road, and you couldn't let any of your men fall. Anyway, that's the kind of thing you had to work out. And then at the end of selection, the last 4 days, it said we had this endurance march, and once you passed that, if you passed that, you would get what they call badged, where they'd give you your beret, chocolate brown, color of earth, with your Selous Scouts badge, and they give you your stay, which was green, which was also a bush color. When they fed you, the times they fed you, the first time we got fed, there were only 20 of us left by this time, maybe 40. That's right, there were 40. They brought me into this tent. We had to sing these chimaringa songs, which were these freedom songs that the guerrillas used. And they said, Captain, they called me Captain America. Why don't you come in and see what you guys are going to eat tonight? This is after we hadn't been fed for 4 days. So I walked into this tent, which is really poorly lit, and I hear this buzzing going on, and it sounded like a huge mass of flies. I said, "What on earth is that?" And he was a color sergeant, equivalent of about an E7, and he said, "Well, Captain America, we're going to show you what you have for dinner tonight." I said, "Oh yeah, that's pretty cool." And he puts this flashlight on, something hanging from a rope. It's just massive of meat there, and it's covered in flies. I said, "Jesus Christ, what is that? How long have those flies been on there?" And he said, "About 4 days, 5 days." I said, "And you're going to feed us that? What the hell is it?" He said, "Well, that's a baboon." I said, "You want to say that again, please?" He said, "Yeah, you're going to eat a 4-day rotten baboon." Sure enough, they cooked it up, and I ate it like a... Well, there's a trick to that. You can cook rotten meat once, and it's good. You can't cook it again because you're going to recook the inherent poisons, and it'll kill you. But you cook it the first time, you can get away with it. And it was a little well done, but I wouldn't have cared if they'd given me a hacksaw at that point. I was just so damn hungry. I'd lost 30 pounds on that selection. 30 pounds. And on my frame in those days, I was seeing a girl back in Salisbury, and she saw me the day after I came back, and she said, "You don't even look like the same person." Because I dropped from about 190 to 160, 155. Yeah. That's about right, too. That's just about right. Looking what they call scrawl, or skinny as hell.
They're eating the contents of impala guts, I think.
Yeah.
In this photo.
Yeah, that's right. That's about right. They would shoot an impala and bring it back to the guys who survived, and they would cut this impala up. And there you go. I know that guy on the left there. I don't remember his name, but I remember him from Scouts. He was a sergeant. Anyway, they would cut the impala up, and they would cut up the raw liver and say, if you ever need a real good shot of iron, you want to take about a cubic inch of raw liver and eat that. Now, you don't want to eat a whole lot because you can actually get iron poisoning, but they said for a short burst, to get your iron capacity back up to norm, you can eat this raw. And so we did. We ate that. We ate the intestines. They showed you how to make glue out of the hooves. It was an astonishing display of bushcraft, where they used virtually every part of that animal to make something. They boil the horns and the hoofs down, as I said, to a glue. That glue was like steel glue. It would attach two steel bars together. I couldn't believe it, but stuff really worked. But they would eat every part of that animal, and they would take the bones and they would heat them, and then they would until they were almost kind of malleable. They heat it in water, and they could actually extract the marrow from the bones, and it was like a jelly, like an orange sort of gel, and you could eat that, and that was almost as good as pure iron. There wasn't anything that they didn't use. Those Selous Scouts really knew what they were doing. So anyway, after a 2-week selection course, I get I get admitted. I pass selection, and I get assigned as the second in command of 2 groups. Selous Scouts had 3 operational groups, all of about 100 men. Usually a major commanded one of those, and you had a captain as the second in command, or 2 IC. But I worked under a captain then, who's quite a bit senior to me, Basil Moss. And so I took over as second in command under him, and I started running operations with Selous Scouts down we looked at it a little earlier on the map, it was down in the right-hand corner around Cheretsey, and that was where my group was stationed. We had another group up in the northeast in a place called Rusapi. That was one group. 2 group was mine down in the right-hand corner of the country. 3 group, there you go. Go up to the right there, about a little bit further north. There you go, right there, right about there. That was Rusapi. That was where one group was situated because, as I said, remember all that infiltration that came in across the border? They were there for that. I was down there in Operation Repulse at the very bottom, right about a little bit to the right there, a little bit up. There you go, right there. That was where my group was, 2 group, because there was a lot of infiltration coming in from that area. And 3 group was over there to the left in Bulawayo, just outside of Bulawayo, because of the operations that they needed to mount in Botswana. So we had the country sort of covered in that respect. And we would send these teams out of these call signs. Each group was broken down at 100 men. We had about 30, about 25-man groups or so, called call signs. And those 5-man groups would then go out and work in various areas as covert operators. Now, they were dressed exactly as guerrillas, exactly. They had beards. We were the only unit in the Rhodesian army that was allowed to wear beards. So they had these beards. They had dressed in blue jeans and khakis. They carried AKs and RPDs, PKMs, So that man right there is by his name of Wally Inch, INSCH. He was a team leader of mine when I went to Selous Scouts, and
Wow.
he was a good operator. This guy was a class sergeant, good operator. I love the guy, just as proficient as he could ever be. And he actually, when I was with the RLI, he was on it in Selous Scouts. He called me into a call sign where we wiped out a group of 9 one day, and he was a funny kid, and I really liked him a lot. He was a good guy, Wally Inch, and he's just coming back off an operation right there. So that's what we'd do. We'd work in these small teams of, and there'd be one European there, and then you'd have a group of about 6 or 7 men, and I was with what's known as a control group. So I had myself, I had a radio operator who was a European, and then I had 2 other men for security. So there were 4 of us, and we'd stay on top of this one hill in an area. And then I would direct these call signs of 4 and 5 men, 6 men, who were all African Selous Scouts. And these guys would go out, and at night, they would go into villages. And of course, they looked exactly like guerrillas, exactly. They had all the vocabulary, they had the training, call signs, everything. And they'd go into these villages and be treated exactly like guerrillas, because the population didn't know. They thought they were the real deal. And often they would meet up with legitimate guerrilla groups at night. And if you can imagine anything hairier than that, you let me know. And they would talk and, have, chimmering songs and beer and all kinds of stuff. And they would then find out where this resident group came from. Usually it wasn't very far away, maybe a couple hundred yards, maybe a K or 2. And then they would find a location. They'd call that information back to me as a controller sitting on the top of the hill, and I'd call Fire Force in on the groups themselves. Yep. Now he's got a Bronze Cross Rhodesia. He's been decorated for bravery. Can't remember his name. I know the guy, but generally they block the faces out.
Obert Masake. Oberta or Obert Masake. No, Obert Mabalaki. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Makasi. That was that's who he was. He wasn't in my group. He was in one group, I think.
Oh,
but
wow.
These guys you got to get decorated for bravery. He hung his ass out to dry, and he did something really, really hairy to get awarded a Bronze Cross. I mean, the Rhodesians did not hand decorations out. They in the entire war, there were only 2 Grand Crosses of Valor awarded in the entire war. That's like our Medal of Honor. 2 in a 12-year war with several 100,000 men having passed through the ranks. Only 2 were awarded. One was to a Selous Scout, one was to an SAS officer. And Silver Crosses of Rhodesia, those are equivalent to Navy Crosses in the Marines. Hardly ever saw them. To see a guy decorated for bravery was just exceptional, because the Rhodesians were hard taskmasters in that respect. You had to do a lot to get any kind of decoration at all. And that's how we operated. So I'd be a controller sitting on top of this hill with my little call sign, and then I would send these 4, 5, 6, 7 man groups to various positions. I'd have about 8 of them under my command, and I'd move them around from one spot to another and try get them to make contact with these legitimate guerrilla groups. And once I had that information, as I said, I would call back, and I would call Fire Force in on these targets. And now, of course, I couldn't see all the targets because these would be closer to the groups that saw them. So I would hand that over to an African corporal, and he would be the one to direct Fire Force in on a target. That's how much trust we placed it in our NCOs. This kid could have been more than 20 years old, maybe corporal, and he would direct the whole Fire Force in on an operation. And so the K car would come over, and the scout on the ground that saw where the guerrillas were would say, "Okay, drop your smoke." So he put a smoke in, and the Selous Scout, who would be several, maybe several hundred meters away, would say, "Right, that's exactly where they are." So that's when the Fire Force vertical envelopment operation began. And that operator, Selous Scout, would then hand over all of that traffic and operation to the K car commander, who was flying around in that big gunship above. It worked seamlessly. It worked like magic. It was incredible how smooth this operation went.
Gosh, I mean, y'all's training and what y'all went through. I mean, y'all had to be prepared for a lot. I mean, not just like in Vietnam, not just for the enemy, but I mean, just as much the wildlife, the heat. I mean, it could vary. The elements could just very easily kill you as much as the enemy could.
I came down off the hill one time. We'd finished an operation. It was very, very successful. We ended up getting about, in that week, we would go out for we'd go out for 10 days at a time. And we came in, got picked up by trucks. This is near in Gundul. And we got on these trucks. They were covered trucks because you didn't want, I mean, these guys were still dressed exactly like guerrillas. My guys were. So the trucks were covered so civilians couldn't see inside. And we started driving back to Trezi, which was about a 40-minute drive. And my guys start laughing about something. Well, I didn't speak Shona. So I turned to my corporal at the time and said, what is so damn funny? And he said, oh, Ishe, which is a word for sir. He said, you did not see that. I said, what? He said, you did not see the snake? I said, what are you talking about? He said, you did not see the snake who was over your head for 4 days up there? I said, what are you, Corporal Mupafi, I think his name Mupafi. I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh, there was a boomslang. It's one of the world's 4 or 5 most poisonous snakes. They're awful. They bite you, and you don't have time to get medevac back to an area. The chopper would have taken 15 minutes out, a couple minutes to load, 15 minutes back. I would have never made it. They kill you that fast. He said, oh, he said, you were a dead man. You were dead. We left. We say prayer for you. So, well, why didn't you tell me? He said, it would have done no good. You've probably been scared. You jumped up, you hit the snake bites you, you die. It's that simple. And that's what that's what they were laughing about, that this snake was in a tree over my head for 4 days. I didn't see the damn thing. They saw it. I didn't see squat. They left it there because they didn't want to disturb the snake. Sometimes they just, left stuff in place and let life go as it went. No disrespect to me, but they just said, if it bites you, it bites you, and that's your tough luck, kid. Holy moly. I had to look that up afterwards. I said to these guys when I got back to her, I said, tell me about a boomslang. Oh, that's a killer. That's a killer. They look green and they go right into a tree. I mean, I could have easily stood up, put my hand over the top of that tree branch or so, because it's only like 3 or 4 feet over my head. I think it was about 8 feet long, this big. It was a monster.
The other, because someone had asked about animals and the thing, and that this being a perfect instance to talk about it, because you talk about, I mean, you saw the rats in Vietnam, you've seen the rats in really all over the world. Could you talk about the rats and then that dadgum toad also? I mean,
I before I went to Selous Scouts, when I was in the RLI, I was up in a place called Inyanga, which is in the eastern districts. It rained a huge amount up there. It was there are a lot of tea estates up there because they needed the go up to the Handi Valley right there on the right. Handi Valley on the right hand side. Right there. There you go. That's the Handi. Yeah. I was right there, right in that area. And it was during the monsoons, during the rainy season, which was around December, January or so. And it rained. It's the hardest rain I can ever remember, even harder than Vietnam.
wow.
And I came out of the tent one day, going over to lunch. It was about noon or so. And I see this, it looked like a rock that was in my path, going across the little walkway there. And I'm about to kick this rock. And one of them said, Jesus, sir, don't do that. Don't do that. I said, what's wrong with it? And he said, well, take a look at it for one thing. And I looked closer and it looked like this sort of about the size of a bowling ball. I said, Christ, this thing has eyes. what is this? He said, well, it's a frog. I said, that thing is this, it's the size, it looked like a basketball there. It was huge. It was huge. It was like this. I think that thing probably weighed 10 pounds. Had this big mouth, these ugly eyes, and I just knew that if it came after me, it was going to run me right off the side of a cliff. That was the biggest, meanest looking frog I've ever seen. And when it croaked, it really didn't croak. It sort of growled. And you could hear these things at night. And it sounded like a mad dog out there. And you get half a dozen of them in the mating season, and you can't sleep. They were just gargantuan. So that was a pleasant little afternoon. And about a year later, I was coming back from a meeting with some locals during we were planning an operation. And I was driving back through the sugarcane fields, and Rhodesia had a tremendous amount of sugarcane. That was another way foreign exchange earner. And they actually used that sugarcane, and they would refine that for gasoline. It was gasohol that they used, and so they were self-sufficient in that. They as a result of being able to do that, they were able to cut back on their import of oil through South Africa by about 50%. So that cut down on foreign exchange reserves going out of the country. So they were able to refine the sugarcane into workable gasoline that would fuel up any car or bus in the country. And so I was in an area that had these big sugarcane fields, and I drove by about 10 o'clock at night, and I see these two, it's like flashlights in the road in front of me. Big green, sort of amber, or big green flashlights. And I slow down because I said, what in the hell, is that an animal? As I went by, I saw this rat. Holy Jesus, was this the biggest rat? They were called cane rats. And they were bigger than the rats I saw in Vietnam. They were enormous, absolutely enormous. Size of cats, maybe a little larger than a cat. Huge. And as I went by, I sort of drove the truck by, and I was in a Land Rover. I slowed down to look at this thing. He didn't even move. It's not like, I ran him off the road. He stood there and looked at me going by. I have to say, man, you're on my road. What the hell are you doing here? Get out of Dodge. He wasn't afraid of squat. And those rats lived in those cane fields, and they would, sometimes they would bite. That's just about right, too. That's just about right. Imagine you see a rat that big. You ever seen a rat that size?
That's terrifying.
Holy. It is terrifying. And you could hear them. If you were working in cane fields at night, you'd hear them moving through the bush. They sounded like people, like men.
I mean, they were the feet and tail on that thing. I mean,
I know. It's hard to believe that anything that big would exist out there in the bush. But yeah, and you get a half a dozen of them working together out there. It sounds like a battalion moving towards you.
I thought I've heard of big rats, and you see the marsupials that get billed as the biggest rats or rodents, but that is that's surely the biggest rat I've ever seen, an actual rat. That, I mean, I snakes, spiders, and rats of any particular size are where I draw the line. I would have probably had to pull out a gun and start shooting or something, because
No, you think so?
I need none.
I walked. I was in a base camp at night. We were up in the same place, Handy Valley, and I came from a tent, from the mess hall, from the tent back to my tent, my hooch, and it was on the same path where I saw this mutant frog, and they said, when you walk at night on paths, you need to stamp your feet, because the snakes will lie on the path, and that's where they get their warmth. Of course, they're cold-blooded, so they don't heat themselves. So they want to retain the heat from the midday sun, and the best place is on a sort of dirt path. So I failed to do that one night, and I didn't stamp my feet and sort of try to scare this whatever. If there were any snakes, they're off. And I've got a flashlight, and I put this flashlight up, and there is a cobra that must have been 10 feet long, 10 or 12 feet long. And I'm probably 15 feet, 12, 15 feet from it when it comes back and raises itself and puts this hood up. And I'm telling you, Bud, that hood must have been 9 inches wide. That thing was huge. That was not the biggest cobra I ever saw over there, but it was. And they have spitting cobras over there too.
Oh,
which actually, yeah, they'll actually throw out venom through their mouths and they'll blind victims before they go after them. Rats and things of that nature. So it saves them from having to constrict or bite. They kill them that way. It was awful. That wildlife over there was just another. You really are literally in another world. You cross rivers, you got to be ready for hippo.
People were going to ask, did you see hippos and any elephants?
I had an elephant actually give me what they call a false charge one time. I was, they cut territory out just like all animals do, and I had come up with a team, and I had breached this sort of area of his, and I guess they were in mating season, and he found that offensive, and he does this mock charge to me. Now, if they come at you and they're waving their ears and their trunks are going up and down, it's a mock charge. They're just trying to scare you off. But if they tuck their ears back and curl their trunk up, you better stand by, because your day is going to get really interesting. And that's what he did. He mocked us once, and my guy started backing up, and I didn't know what the hell it meant. And then his ears go back and his trunk up, and I had a corporal. He said, "Sir, you better run. We got to run." And we hoofed it off, and we hit ourselves in these big, thick bush. And that's the only way. But he came right past us. He was pissed. He was pissed. We'd interrupted some sort of mating ritual or something. But he was not big bull elephant, probably 5 tons. You don't want to mess around.
You just saw where the not villagers, there was a safari in, I don't know where at in Africa, but they were just recently this week. They were at a preserve, a big famous one that's run great and everything, but they had gotten too close to a male and thought they had outran it on the truck. And sure enough, you see him catching up on the side, just plowing over trees, and he's got his nose tucked, and he broadsides the mess out of that. And sadly, a lady died. He pushed it over on top of the entire group.
Wow. Was his trunk curled up? You said
yes.
Trunk? Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, ears pinned back like a dog going at you.
Really?
Oh,
How about that? Yeah, that's classic. That's classic bull behavior. And I'll bet they were probably in mating season. Maybe the truck came too close to a female in estrus, and that's all it takes sometimes. And they will attack. They can be passive otherwise and sort of let you almost walk right under them, but sometimes they get a little persnickety when they're
that time of the year.
Yeah, exactly. How about that? No.
We're here at the 2-hour mark, and I still because you've got an interesting post military story. Is there anything would you like to because guys, there's so much to cover. We'd be in multiple episodes. Y'all really need to get this book. But is there anything you would like to maybe segue with Rhodesia closing out, and maybe your last operations or such, and how you finally decided to wrap it up and maybe pursue your scholarly pursuits?
Yeah, I had gotten paratyphoid over there. I had drunk some dirty water in an external operation outside Rhodesia, outside the borders. It was dirty water, and I knew it was dirty when I drank it. And it took about a year to manifest itself, and it sort of absorbed my gallbladder and my liver, and I was sick as hell. I lost weight. I was lethargic. It was terrible. I could hardly hold my head up, and I just barely make it through the last few days of of my service. It's probably a good idea that the war ended at that time. This is in early 1980, because I was pretty sick. So I end up leaving the country. Our side lost. They drew an agreement with the African nationalists. These were the aggressive types. The moderates were, as I said, long gone, and they took the government over on April 8th of, I think it was 1980. And so with the end of that war, of course, I had no business being over there. So I end up going home, and it takes me, I'm on my back almost for 2 solid years. I'm living with my brother because I can't hold a job down. I didn't have the energy to do that. So he took pity on me, and I was able to live with him for a couple of years. And I figured, oh, geez, man, this is no way to live. You need to go on for graduate work. So I ended up going to the American University in Cairo, and then I transferred up to the American University of Beirut. And I ended up getting, I was there for 2 years, and I ended up getting my master's degree. After that, I got kidnapped while I was there by Hezbollah, which is another entirely different story there. But they caught me, and I was in a car. I was actually going to the hospital, and they pulled me right out of the hospital, out of the emergency room, and gun right under the throat, togger off, and so I was held by them for 4 days, and finally, a moderate Lebanese politician heard about me and intervened and was able to get me released. His name was Nabi Berri, and he's the only reason I'm still alive today, because I would have never survived with 4 days. I had an intestinal blockage from Vietnam where I got shot up. I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't drink. I don't think I'd have made it another 3 or 4 days. So I ended up in the hospital there with surgery. I finished my degree in 85, and I come back and I start working, teaching a little bit. And then I figured, well, you're not going anywhere in this field unless you have your PhD. It's just one of these fields where you can't go any further without the doctorate. It's just, you can't do it. Not in any school worth its salt. So I ended up going to the University of London at the School of Oriental and African Affairs, and I finished my PhD there in 1999, I guess it was. And I was still so sick. That was another problem. I was still so sick in those days that I couldn't continue this research of mine, day after day, week after week, month after month. So I'd have to take about 3 or 4 months off and rest, and then go back to my work. So it took me, several years to get through this PhD program. But once I did, I get back. I start teaching at a college here in the Washington, D.C. area. I get married. I have my 2 children, and I'm one of these guys that married really late. I mean, I think I was 58 before I had my daughter. I was like 60 before I had my son.
Wow.
Yeah, it was.
Thought my dad was late at 42.
Yeah, no, the way you do that is you have to get a young chick to do this, because it's she's 25 years younger than I, so that was the only way I was able to pull this off. For you. And my girl is now 18, and she's at Georgetown University. Wow. And my boy is 16, and he's a lacrosse player at St. John's College University. We're hoping he'll get a D1 scholarship, because he's on a pretty good little team there. So, and that's where I am now. So I sort of left teaching about 6 months ago, and I'm just here, driving my wife nuts.
Well, I mean,
she's an attorney with the federal government. So with the COVID and so on, she works from home. So she restricts me to this room in the back here where I can make as little noise as possible.
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely put in enough work. I would have to say, if she gives you any trouble, let us know, and we'll say, hey, he's put in work all across the world. Here, you got to cut the doc some slack here. All right. I mean, that's amazing. Not only you pursuing the best of the best, and wanting to be the best of the best in your military career, and guys, we're going to get to the questions, but also in your pursuit of academics. I mean, you went to as you said, the American University in Cairo. You had that. Well, you were at the Citadel, which is a prestigious school. Your foreign studies in Cairo. It's just amazing that you didn't take the normal way. You could have came here and studied all of this, but you wanted to be where you could actually learn it, live it, and do like you were doing in the military. And then for you to get your PhD and teach, I mean, you know, some people don't even accomplish the military side of what you've done, and you're doing both of this. It really makes your story on a closing note just that much more interesting. That you've got the brains as well as the bronze to do all of this.
Well, some people would say, you know, there's a lack of the former because of what I did after the Marines. That it was an idiotic 4 years to spend. But I figured, you know, if you're going to go through this life once, let's do something you want to do, for Christ's sakes. You get these people who are my age, I'm 77, who say, boy, you know, if only I could have, and they live their life in regret. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't make any money throughout my life, to be sure. I mean, you know, these are not the most prolifically well-paid jobs, to be sure, but I sort of did what I wanted to do, so I was not going to have regrets as I got older. And it's a trade-off. Now, you either make yourself a career and you do well and have that sort of financial background, or you can be poor, but having accomplished some of the things you wanted to accomplish. And I'm certainly not poor by any means, but had I devoted a life to a dedicated pursuit, perhaps I wouldn't have had these weird stories and weird background and got shot up and all the other stuff that went along with it, and then sick as a dog and and so on. So as I said, you get trade-offs, and we do what we think we're supposed to do, and I guess we save the regrets for later. But I didn't want to have any. Let's put that. I just didn't want to have any as I got older.
That's for sure. There are millions of people saying, like you said, I wish I could have done that, or I should have done that. And, like you said, you only get one chance to what if it, or can I do it? Should I do it? And if you don't do it, you'll live the rest of your life saying, God, I should have at least tried it. And that's one thing also, guys. He goes into it and more. I mean, he did make it sound as bad as it was, but he was in a lot of pain. I mean, not just from his stuff in Vietnam, but getting drinking the bad water. I mean, this stuck with him for a long time. I mean, his stomach literally stopped up. I mean, it was bad. You were Captain America. I like that when he called you that, trying to bust your cojones, so to speak. But I like that. You're definitely Captain America here. Would you mind if we've got a few questions, and if I don't see any that'll pop up, I'm sure I'll get one or two in more to close out the show on a good note. We kind of covered it, but maybe if you could speak a little bit about the rifles you did shoot or use that you liked. Guerrilla was curious, what rifle did you carry while in Rhodesia? And
I had an FN while I was with the Rhodesian Light Infantry, but when I went across to Selous Scouts, I carried a Polish AK, and I had a 75 round drum on the AK. It was actually AKM that I carried. We captured this in we got this in the Chilimansi down in the Southern Districts. We hit a group down there, and this guy was carrying a brand new Polish AK. So I had that, and I also had a Makarov that I took off a dead terrorist, a guerrilla, in another firefight. So I put the 45 aside because I didn't want to really carry that kind of weapon out in the bush. You had to carry, if you're going to do that, you had to be legitimate. So I carried the uniform I wore was Russian camouflage.
Wow.
And we used boots that didn't have any sort of pattern on the bottom of it. These are flat. These were boots that were without any sort of trace at all on those. They're rubber soled with the Russian utilities, Russian uniform, and the Polish AK with the drum. So that's pretty much what I went to the bush with.
Did you have any issues with that drum? Was it pretty good to
No,
go?
Again, it's a 75 round drum, but I only put like 65 rounds in it. And so we'd go out for a month and then we'd come back for 10 days. And for 10 days, I'd take all the rounds out and let the ring, the spring rest, clean it, and then reload it again as I went out. But you need to rest those springs, as you only too well know, with any magazine or drum.
That's great. And a brand new Polish AK with a 75 round drum. That is too cool for school, sir. Daniel is did y'all's 20 millimeter
right.
HEs have the effect of the hand grenade?
Yeah, that's about right. That's exactly right too. You get that sort of burst on the ground when it hits, and that's a perfect comparison there with a small frag and that 20 mil that throws that sort of shrapnel off. Yeah, that's a good comparison.
And the gunners in the cars were pretty daggum good. You've got some stories where they absolutely lay waste to some of the guys out there in the bushes.
Exceptional.
I had a friend, go ahead. Go ahead with your story. I'm sorry.
No. I had a friend who was on Fire Force who got hit. He was came up over top of a rock face, and he was an officer. And the K-car gunner thought that these guys were guerrillas because they just came out of the top and went right over the top, and he fired on this group. And one of the HE rounds hit next to my friend. He didn't get one piece of shrapnel, but he took a spiral fracture from the concussion of the round from his ankle all the way up to his knee. Can you imagine what that must have, both bones there had spiral fractures in them all the way up there. Oh man, was he hurt? He was in a cast for something like 4 months. That poor guy. He ended up going down to South Africa. His name was Simon Willar, good friend of mine. But man, he almost got that thing. The HE hit about a foot and a half, 2 feet from him. And concussion knocked him right off the top of the rock face, knocked him through the air.
I don't know how he would have been very well after that. I mean, that's a serious. I mean, especially a spiral all the way up. Yep. I mean that'll alter your walking for the rest of your life.
That's true. That's true enough. I'm sorry, I cut that guy off in his question.
Oh no, it's fine, sir. We're here to listen to you. We've got time to get to the questions. Guerrilla again. He's a gun guy. He's helps me out a lot. He's a very, very good guy. Did you have any firsthand experience with the South African Vector R4 or 5 pattern rifles? If so, what's your opinion on them?
I'm going to plead ignorance on this. I'm not sure what those are. Vector R4 or 5. What are those?
Let me pull up a picture real quick. Vector R.
We worked with some South Africans. I could have seen this without even knowing it.
It looks kind of like the Guerrilla. Let me pull this up real quick. Sorry about this, guys. I'm doing it very quick. You know what? I'm going to pull up the whole dadgum page, and that way we won't have to do this. Share screen, Vector 4. Has that popped up?
Oh, yeah. No, they weren't using those then. They were using, in fact, they had FNs back in those days. Same rank, same weapon we did. They started using those in the bush after I left in 1980. And these are folding stock weapons right there on the left. There's no stock on the right. No, they never used those at all in the when I was working with them in late 1979, early 80. I think from their reputation, they're supposed to be pretty good weapons. You know, did they use a 5.5? What is that? 5.56?
Galil, will you help us out? Let me see if it's still got it on there. Let me pull up the fandom here. Is a 7.62 by 51 NATO round. Yes, sir. Oh no, the R4 comes in a 5.56 45 millimeter NATO assault rifle developed in South Africa in 1980s to replace the 7.62. So it is a 5.56.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. They by that time they were working up in Angola, and I think they felt like they needed. Yeah, I see that. Okay, cool. Uh, when they were in Angola, it came out. So yeah, exactly. That sounds just about right because they transitioned to that as I was leaving the country, so I never had experience with that. But they used those up in Angola and Southwest Africa when they were fighting up there because I guess they felt that the 7.62 heavies were too much weight to be carrying in the bush, so they went to a lighter weapon. It's kind of like we did with the M14 to transition to the M16.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. I knew this one was going to come up because we're always interested in scroungers.
Yeah.
Were there any Rhodesian scroungers or Jeep stealers or any style antics going around in Rhodesia like in Vietnam?
All the time. All the time. Spare parts there were guys whose only job was to go around and pilfer spare parts. That was their dedicated work. And they would hit various repair shops, repair facilities. Now, they wouldn't steal from civilians. This was only a sort of intermilitary business.
Mm-hmm.
They'd leave the civilians alone. But we had, what do they call them? They were called rats of some kind. I don't remember. Mech rats is what they were, mechanical rats. And these guys were whose job it was to go into various other military facilities and steal spare parts that we simply couldn't get otherwise. So and eventually it all evened out because we'd steal from them, and they'd end up stealing from us. So it was a big circle. So everybody ended up happy. It's just the way it worked out.
About to say, as long as everyone ends up happy and gets at least something to work with, we're happy here.
And the Rhodesians were pretty good. They were able to manufacture a lot of their own parts too. They got to the point where they didn't really need to import a lot of stuff because they were sort of self-sufficient in so many areas. So the stealing went on in the early days, and it was rampant, just prolific. But as the war went on, when the country started making its own spare parts, I think that need sort of dissipated.
That's Meekrat. Yeah. Okay. That's one thing that was so interesting to find out how much work was going into to not only skirt the sanctions but internally remaking stuff and all of that. And
Sure.
let me hit this question, and then we've got two more. I've always been curious because if I'm not mistaken, this is where the future Iraq and Afghanistan MRAPs and all that would come from. Aren't these for the mines and all of that with the V-shaped holes to where?
Yeah. Those monocoque hulls were built with a V so that the mine blasts would go out instead of directly up. And that's what saved so many lives over there. You can see the V-shaped hull right there. Now, those tires that they have right there on the side were filled with water.
Oh.
And what that would do is when that hit a TM-46 or so landmine, the blast would go up, but the water would absorb a lot of the blast.
God, that is ingenious.
And that was a Rhodesian sort of introduction to landmine warfare. So sometimes they would boost these TM-46s with some mortars. So they bury the TMs, they put 2 or 3 mortars, 61s on top of these things, and you'd compress that. And you couldn't do it if you walked by because these things took 500 pounds of pressure. So they weren't going to waste them on a man. Mm-hmm. It took a vehicle. But once that tire rolled over it, those TMs and the mortars would then blow up. And I think in that entire war, Bud, I don't think we lost more than about 30 or 40 men in landmine explosions in the military because of that. And just those two amendments there, that hull that goes up and out, and the water-filled tires.
I mean, here y'all are, fighting the enemy, the sanctions, everything else going, and y'all are not only, striving in some aspects, but making stuff that would later become, multi-million billion-dollar projects for the United States Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean,
the question actually brings up a very interesting point. I worked on a contract back in 91 with the Marine Corps about, this is just before Desert Storm started, and they were asking us about how Rhodesia mine-proofed its vehicles. So I took a trip with another guy, and we went on this contract tour to Scotland and Rhodesia and then back again. And we wrote a position paper on how these monocoque hulls, these V-shaped hulls, and water-in tires saved so many lives in Rhodesia. But the armed forces didn't use those. They didn't use that design in Desert Storm. And I don't know how many men they lost over there from landmines, because they were using these flat bottom Humvees that didn't deflect anything. It absorbed everything up. And we didn't have that concept in Vietnam either. So we lost a lot of men that way. But they finally figured out maybe the Rhodesians were onto something. And, maybe this is the way to go now. If you're working with landmine warfare and anti-mine warfare, maybe you better start having deflecting apparatus on there, so these blasts go up and out instead of straight up.
And if I'm not mistaken, they even used another one. I think y'all also created the one with the V-shaped hole, and then the implement or the device with a set of wheels in front of the actual vehicle that was almost like a pre-vehicle to maybe trip something or.
Yeah, they had the mine detectors. These were called Pookies, and these were very lightweight machines, one-man machines, and they put racing tires, Indy racing tires, on these Pookies. They bought the racing tires from the South Africans, and so you had these. They were like slicks that were like 18 inches wide, no tread, and they only put 4 pounds of pressure on the ground per square inch. I mean, they could roll right over your foot, and you wouldn't feel like a pillow. And they would use these things as mine detection vehicles to precede convoys. And they'd have these 2 big flat beds on the right that would go down. They're like sheets that would drop down off the side of the vehicle. And these would detect any sort of metallic bits in the road. And so these Pookies used to run right over landmines, right over them, and then back up again and say, oh yeah, we pick up the metallic fragments here. And so this is where you got a landmine. So they'd get the engineers out there, dig these things up, and the convoy would proceed right along. That was another innovative thing that the Rhodesians sort of used. 4 pounds of pressure per square inch. Imagine that.
I mean, and guys, I've got to show this one. There is a great, literally, guys, y'all can type in Rhodesian anti-mine vehicles, and there is just a slew of amazing photographs. And many of you veterans of Afghanistan or Iraq will recognize some body styles. I mean, look at this.
There you go.
Have a sapper for supper.
Yeah, that's it. So there you're. Now this is a real early model, because the later models, that cab was closer to the bed itself, and those tires right there, you can see those came off Indy cars right there, and those platforms at the bottom there were wider. They were about 4 feet wide and maybe the same length, and that's a rope. You got a good picture there. That's this cable, and those things would drop. They would generally sit right alongside, and then when they got to the road, they would drop these things down off the cable, and then he would go over the road at about, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 miles an hour. And those platforms right there would pick up the metallic fragments in the TMs. And then there was little, he'd have a pair of earphones on like you're wearing, and they were tuned to the plates themselves, the drop downs.
I mean, this is crazy that y'all were able to do this. I mean, I'm utterly astounded at what y'all were able. And guys, just seriously, y'all, if y'all don't do anything else today after listening to this or tonight, Google Rhodesian anti-mine vehicles, and your mind will be blown, because that's just one of them. And I thought it looked pretty cool, and I'm glad it tied in and was an early one where we could hear a little bit of that history. But that is,
Bud, they named them Pookies because there was a small bush animal that used to live out there in the what the Gungan they called, and it was like a tiny antelope about the size of a cat, maybe a little bit larger, and it let out this little sound. It sounded almost like a little cry, and it sounded like the thing was saying Pookie, and so it was very silent, very quiet, and so they named this vehicle after that little bush pig.
God, this is why I'm glad we had you to help us out today, because I told you I'd be asking all kinds of questions, and we might actually have to have you back. But we've got 2 more questions right here, and we're at 2 hours and 35 minutes. Wow, interesting. Who was the biggest man you saw operating in Rhodesia, as well as the smallest man you saw?
I had a machine gunner in my troop who was about 6'5", maybe 280, 290. The guy could have played NFL, and he's the biggest man I ever saw over there. And appropriately enough, he was called Rhino. That's what he was known as. He was just, God, he had 3-inch arms, and he was a all Rhodesia weightlifter who actually competed with the South Africans in the '72 Olympics. I don't think he placed, but he was an Olympian. That's how strong he was.
My God.
The smallest guy I ever saw was maybe 4'10". I don't think he weighed more than 110 pounds. And this guy used to be he was caveman, because he would volunteer to go into these caves by himself. I thought he was crazy as hell. I thought he was like one of those tunnel rats in Vietnam. But caveman would take a Browning in there, and he'd have a gas mask too. We had CS gas, and he would throw the gas mask in the cave, and then he'd go in after throw the canister in the cave, and go in with a gas mask with a 9mm, and that was it. And if there was anybody in there, he'd drill them, or he'd chase them out the other end, or whatever. He was a wild man. This guy was a wild man. 4'10", one of the bravest guys I ever met in my life. Wasn't scared of anything. Or he was, I don't know which, but he was a tough little hombre, that's for sure. Caveman and Rhino.
Gosh, that will.
And they were friends. They were in the same troop, and of course, they gravitate to one another. He looked like a dwarf next to this guy. This guy was, when I say he was a monster, he was a behemoth. He was just huge. But he and Caveman, yeah, they used to go on R&R together and all kinds of things. They went to one another's weddings, and
We'll now be looking forward to hearing more about Rhino and Caveman if we can get you back on. That's before I put this last one in. That's interesting, because you mentioned in your book there's a Brit that takes you under his wing, a Brit SAS, because he was kind of an outsider when he got there. I think you run into, is it 2 Canadians, or at least 1 Canadian? I think sadly he passes away. I know there's Portuguese. I mean, there was a lot of ethnicities down there, not just the Chinese, Russian, and I mean there was a lot of ethnicities.
Oh, sure. You had a lot of Brits, of course. You had a lot of Scots, Irish, a lot of people from the UK. Of course, they sort of drifted down. Americans. You had Germans. You had people, a lot of Belgians. Some who came over from the Belgian Congo, fighting in the '60s. They ended up in Rhodesia. A lot of expatriates, mostly European. Had a couple of Koreans who came in from the South Korean Army. We had a kid from Taiwan who joined. I don't remember a country that wasn't represented, honestly, from Europe anyway.
That
You know,
is that is wild.
if, guy, if guys were looking for a fight, that was the place to go.
And you mentioned it, there definitely were not there were some good fighters coming in, and there were some bad ones that wanted to become soldier fortunes.
Yeah, that SOF type. Jesus, Pete, spare me the SOF types. Honestly, what
Yeah,
a
I
bunch
won't.
of talk about rinky dinks. I mean, they were so predictable, and so the great I ams and God when we and all this crap. Jesus, Rhodesians thought they were the biggest bunch of buffoons in the world, and they were invariably Americans, and they just embarrassed the living hell out of me.
Oh yeah,
Because invariably they were just all talk, all bluster, and just BS. I couldn't stand them. When they said they were SRF types, I thought, Jesus, man, give me a break. Just get out of my sight.
You mentioned one or two of the types in the book, and guys, you'll get a kick out of that. I always thought that was pretty interesting. Guys showing up with their gear and telling you what all they're gonna do, and it's like, come on, spare me that, Rambo. Spare me that.
Exactly.
Our last question for the day before we wrap it up for this marathon that we've had. A great one, though. A great one. But Jason's curious. I agree. Rhodesia's got the aesthetics down, and everyone loves it. Did you know at the time that how cool you guys looked in y'all's Rhodesian bush stroke camo?
That was a unique pattern. I agree with you, Jason. It was a first class pattern. I've never seen anything like it. I never in the years, the 10 years I spent in the Marines, I never wore their camouflage camis. I thought the pattern stunk. I wore strictly greens, and I was quite happy with that. Rhodesia had this. I haven't heard brushstroke used before, but it's the perfect description of that. And they did something which was interesting. They gave you a back patch on the butt that went all the way down through the inner thigh, right up through the groin. It was like an extra piece of cloth that was sewn in, so that as many times as you sat on, because we sat on a lot of rocks and bush and it wouldn't wear the bottom part of your camis out. And it was a very clever thing to do, but the pattern itself was really cool too. I thought it was great. And if we come back on again, you remind me, bud, and I'll bring that pattern out for you and show it, because it's a good pattern that works really, really well in the bush. I always thought the pattern that the U.S. used, and still at least used during Vietnam, was really busy, and it didn't break up the contour as much. But this Rhodesia pattern was perfect. It had a lot of brown in it, which is of course what you need in dirt roads and stuff, and had a greens and blacks, and it's very well blended.
It's my favorite, and as a matter of fact, I've got a pair of they're not quite as short as Ranger panties, but I've got some swim trunk Rhodesian brushstroke swim trunks, and I absolutely love them. I'm almost hesitant to wear them out swimming in the river and stuff, because I know inevitably I'm going to rip a hole in them and absolutely ruin them. But I love to wear them and show them off. People are like, what the heck is that? I'm like, these are Rhodesian trunks. You need to look into it. Yes, I can already tell we're going to have you back, because some of the people are saying that are coming in late are going to be sending me questions and all of that I'll be sending you, because they're very eager to ask some questions. But yes, if you wouldn't mind, maybe next month we could set you up coming back and join us, because we would love to have some more Rhodesia.
In that event, we might split it between Vietnam and Rhodesia. If there are any, maybe some people would be interested in both. Spend maybe an hour in Vietnam or an hour in Rhodesia, and wind up covering both theaters.
Okay, absolutely, cool. That would be perfect. I know that everyone would love to have you back for that. That would be wonderful. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna make a note right now to get with you later on this week to maybe set that up to where we can go ahead and have it on the books.
Okay, cool.
Let me see here. I believe, Jason's already saying yes.
All right.
All righty. Well, I believe that's all we've got for today. Is there anything else you would like to close out with, Doc?
No, Bud, you've been really comprehensive with these questions and getting your viewers involved. So, good for you. I mean, it shows you've done your homework, and that's not an exaggeration to say you're a research archivist, because it's obvious you've done your homework. And yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah, you read for notes, and you read for information. So well done. So I congratulate you on a really nicely run show. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again. Next week, 2 weeks from now, and we can just pick up where we left off.
Absolutely. I will. I've got a show tomorrow and Wednesday. How about we just plan? Me and you will link up Thursday or Friday and set a plan.
Sure. Sounds fine.
Excellent. Everyone's going ahead and saying thank you, and I'll pass those along to you. And guys, we're gonna close it out for today. We've almost hit 3 hours, and we're not gonna hold him any longer since we're getting him back. So we are shutting her down, and we will see you guys later.